Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. I've always been a skeptical man, the kind who needs solid proof to believe in something. However, I can't explain what happened that night in the abandoned hospital. Over the years, my investigations into unexplained disappearances and forgotten places had led me down dark paths, but never anything like this. The case began, like so many others, with a simple phone call. A reporter in town, looking for a story for his crime section, had heard rumors of strange disappearances at an old psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town. No one knew exactly when it had closed, or what had happened to the patients who had been there. The records were vague, but what struck me most were the testimonies of the few nearby residents still left in the area. No one wanted to go near the hospital. Some said the building was cursed. Others spoke of strange lights being seen at night. What seemed like just another horror story, something worthy of cheap sensationalism, soon turned into something much more disturbing when I began researching the archives. The hospital, opened in the early 20th century, had been one of the first of its kind in the region, intended to treat people with severe mental illness. However, it closed abruptly in the 1960s, and since then no one had entered its corridors, except the most daring. The local police had made a few raids in search of vandals, but nothing relevant had come of those patrols. Most puzzling was that, in recent years, some people in the town had disappeared without a trace, and the police could find no explanation. The connection to the hospital was not direct, but there was something in the air that made it all seem intertwined. I decided to go on my own, without telling anyone. It wasn't the first time I had wandered into a dangerous place for a story that few dared to touch, and it wasn't going to be the last. The next morning I took my car and drove to the hospital. The landscape was bleak, with gnarled trees lining the road, and as I approached, the building loomed on the horizon, imposing and decaying like a huge shadow over the landscape. The hospital was built on a hill overlooking the village, but access was difficult. You had to go through a small forest and cross a wire fence that, over time, had fallen down in several places. I was not surprised to find the front door open, as if someone was waiting for me. The air inside was thick, laden with the weight of the history those walls held. The musty smell was unbearable, but what disturbed me was not that, but the absolute silence. There was not the slightest sign of life. I entered what looked like a waiting room, with old broken armchairs and yellowed papers scattered on the floor. There had been no trace of human beings in that place for decades. However, something didn't fit. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. Every step I took, the echo of my shoes echoed in the empty corridors, as if I was disturbing a very delicate balance. I went up to the second floor. The rooms were empty, but some of the doors were still open, as if someone had left everything half done. I entered one of the rooms, where the first thing that caught my eye was an old rusty iron bed. Around it, the walls were covered with torn papers, as if someone had desperately tried to tear them off. Upon closer inspection, I found a yellowed photo taped to the wall, a photograph depicting several people in some sort of group. The people were patient, according to the clothing and documents scattered around the place. However, one of the people in the photo was blurred, as if something had erased his face. Curious, I took the photo carefully, and turning it over, I found something handwritten. "Don't let them escape." My skin bristled as I read those words. I felt something wasn't right, as if I was touching something I shouldn't have. My investigation began to move into dangerous territory. As I explored the hospital rooms, I found more clues, fragments of diaries, and objects that seemed to have belonged to patients. In every corner, there were remnants of life, but also hints of a presence that had not gone away. In one room of what appeared to be an old doctor's office, I found a folder of medical records. The patients listed there seemed to have been treated with extremely cruel methods, and many of them, in the last entries, mentioned something about the shadow. Something inside me told me I should leave, but curiosity kept me glued to those documents. As I went deeper into the building, the sensations became more and more intense. The pressure in the air increased, and I felt as if the corridors stretched on endlessly, causing my sense of direction to fade. It was on the second floor that I began to find more disturbing details. Closed doors I had not seen before, and upon opening them, I discovered a series of rooms that were not on the original plans for the hospital. They had been built later, without any architectural logic. The walls were covered with a strange viscous substance that seemed to move with a subtle heartbeat, as if the building itself were alive. In one of these rooms, I found an old electroshock device covered with dust and cobwebs. On the wall, a message was scrawled, "Listen to the voices." It was at that moment that I knew there was more to this place than mere rumors or superstitions. It wasn't just the patients who were disappearing. It was the hospital itself, as if it had absorbed their souls. I felt like I was being dragged away by an invisible force, as if the building itself was warning me to leave. But it was too late. The door closed behind me with a thud, and a thick darkness began to envelop the room. I tried to turn on the flashlight, but the light went out before it fully illuminated the room. At that instant, I heard a whisper, low and almost inaudible, as if 1,000 voices were blending into one sound. At first, I thought it was a product of my mind, tired from so many hours of exploration. But the voices grew louder, clearer, until they became a unified cry of despair. The door burst open, but I was not in the same room. I was now in a narrow, dark hallway, completely different from the hospital I had explored before. The walls seemed to breathe, and the air was charged with unbearable pressure. I saw shadows moving in the corners of my vision, and the sound of my footsteps echoed unnaturally. I didn't know which way to go, but something was urging me forward. At the end of the corridor, a half-open door offered me a way out. I ran towards it, but something stopped me in my tracks. In front of me, a figure appeared, completely motionless, watching me from the shadows. I could see her eyes, though the rest of her face was hidden in the darkness. A shudder ran down my back when I saw that the figure did not move, as if it was waiting for something. I don't remember how I managed to get out of there, or if I ever actually got out. I only know that, when I awoke, I was at the edge of the forest, in the distance where the hospital was barely visible. The sun was already beginning to set, and the air was heavy with an ozone smell, as if it had been raining. The flashlight in my hand was broken, and my clothes were soaked with cold sweat. I had no visible wounds, but something had changed in me. Something inside me told me that the disappearances at the hospital had not been the result of chance. I returned to the city, but I could never tell anyone what I had experienced. No one would have believed what I saw. The police never found anything when they searched the abandoned hospital, as if the place had swallowed up everything that had happened there. And now, every night when I close my eyes, the voices find me. I have always been a skeptical man, one of those who needs solid proof to believe in something. However, I cannot explain what happened that night in the abandoned hospital. Over the years, my investigations into unexplained disappearances in forgotten places had led me down dark paths, but never anything like this. The case began, like so many others, with a simple phone call. A reporter in town, looking for a story for his crime section, had heard rumors of strange disappearances at an old psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town. No one knew exactly when it had closed or what had happened to the patients who had been there. The records were vague, but what struck me most were the testimonies of the few nearby residents still left in the area. No one wanted to go near the hospital. Some said the building was cursed. Others spoke of strange lights being seen at night. What seemed like just another horror story, something worthy of cheap sensationalism, soon turned into something much more disturbing when I began researching the archives. The hospital, opened in the early 20th century, had been one of the first of its kind in the region, intended to treat people with severe mental illness. However, it closed abruptly in the 1960s, and since then no one had entered its corridors except the most daring. The local police had made a few raids in search of vandals, but nothing relevant had come of those patrols. Most puzzling was that, in recent years, some people in the town had disappeared without a trace, and the police could find no explanation. The connection to the hospital was not direct, but there was something in the air that made it all seem intertwined. I decided to go on my own, without telling anyone. It wasn't the first time I had wandered into a dangerous place for a story that few dared to touch, and it wasn't going to be the last. The next morning, I took my car and drove to the hospital. The landscape was bleak, with gnarled trees lining the road, and as I approached, the building loomed on the horizon, imposing and decaying, like a huge shadow over the landscape. The hospital was built on a hill, overlooking the village, but access was difficult. You had to go through a small forest and cross a wire fence that, over time, had fallen down in several places. I was not surprised to find the front door open, as if someone was waiting for me. The air inside was thick, laden with the weight of the history those walls held. The musty smell was unbearable, but what disturbed me was not that, but the absolute silence. There was not the slightest sign of life. I entered what looked like a waiting room, with old broken armchairs and yellowed papers scattered on the floor. There had been no trace of human beings in that place for decades. However, something didn't fit. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. Every step I took, the echo of my shoes echoed in the empty corridors, as if I was disturbing a very delicate balance. I went up to the second floor. The rooms were empty, but some of the doors were still open, as if someone had left everything half done. I entered one of the rooms, where the first thing that caught my eye was an old rusty iron bed. Around it, the walls were covered with torn papers, as if someone had desperately tried to tear them off. Upon closer inspection, I found a yellowed photo taped to the wall, a photograph depicting several people in some sort of group. The people were patient, according to the clothing and documents scattered around the place. However, one of the people in the photo was blurred, as if something had erased his face. Curious, I took the photo carefully, and turning it over, I found something handwritten. "Don't let them escape." My skin bristled as I read those words. I felt something wasn't right, as if I was touching something I shouldn't have. My investigation began to move into dangerous territory. As I explored the hospital rooms, I found more clues, fragments of diaries, and objects that seemed to have belonged to patients. In every corner, there were remnants of life, but also hints of a presence that had not gone away. In one room of what appeared to be an old doctor's office, I found a folder of medical records. The patients listed there seemed to have been treated with extremely cruel methods, and many of them, in the last entries, mentioned something about the shadow. Something inside me told me I should leave, but curiosity kept me glued to those documents. As I went deeper into the building, the sensations became more and more intense. The pressure in the air increased, and I felt as if the corridors stretched on endlessly, causing my sense of direction to fade. It was on the second floor that I began to find more disturbing details. Closed doors I had not seen before, and upon opening them, I discovered a series of rooms that were not on the original plans for the hospital. They had been built later, without any architectural logic. The walls were covered with a strange viscous substance that seemed to move with a subtle heartbeat, as if the building itself were alive. In one of these rooms, I found an old electroshock device, covered with dust and cobwebs. On the wall, a message was scrawled, "Listen to the voices." It was at that moment that I knew there was more to this place than mere rumors or superstitions. It wasn't just the patients who were disappearing. It was the hospital itself, as if it had absorbed their souls. I felt like I was being dragged away by an invisible force, as if the building itself was warning me to leave. But it was too late. The door closed behind me with a thud, and a thick darkness began to envelop the room. I tried to turn on the flashlight, but the light went out before it fully illuminated the room. At that instant, I heard a whisper, low and almost inaudible, as if 1,000 voices were blending into one sound. At first, I thought it was a product of my mind, tired from so many hours of exploration, but the voices grew louder, clearer, until they became a unified cry of despair. The door burst open, but I was not in the same room. I was now in a narrow, dark hallway, completely different from the hospital I had explored before. The walls seemed to breathe, and the air was charged with unbearable pressure. I saw shadows moving in the corners of my vision, and the sound of my footsteps echoed unnaturally. I didn't know which way to go, but something was urging me forward. At the end of the corridor, a half-open door offered me a way out. I ran towards it, but something stopped me in my tracks. In front of me, a figure appeared, completely motionless, watching me from the shadows. I could see her eyes, though the rest of her face was hidden in the darkness. A shudder ran down my back when I saw that the figure did not move, as if it was waiting for something. I don't remember how I managed to get out of there, or if I ever actually got out. I only know that when I awoke, I was at the edge of the forest, in the distance where the hospital was barely visible. The sun was already beginning to set, and the air was heavy with an ozone smell, as if it had been raining. The flashlight in my hand was broken, and my clothes were soaked with cold sweat. I had no visible wounds, but something had changed in me. Something inside me told me that the disappearances at the hospital had not been the result of chance. I returned to the city, but I could never tell anyone what I had experienced. No one would have believed what I saw. The police never found anything when they searched the abandoned hospital, as if the place had swallowed up everything that had happened there. And now, every night, when I close my eyes, the voices find me. The city around me has an air of normality that hides dark secrets. Like all places that have existed for generations, it has overlapping layers, buried histories that time has been obscuring and sealing into oblivion. Some of those secrets, however, are not so far from the surface. I, who have always considered myself a curious man, never imagined I would end up involved in something like this. I'm a journalist, a man dedicated to telling stories that others would rather not see. I'm not the guy who chases ghosts or urban legends, but the facts that the shadows of the city hide. It all started with a simple anonymous phone call. The person on the other end of the line was scared, and his voice was shaking. He told me only one thing. The tunnels under the city are real, and they are closer than you think. At first I thought it was some kind of joke or unfounded rumor. After all, the city has its subway history, ancient catacombs, sewers dating back centuries, and a network of tunnels built to transport water and supplies. But that call didn't put me at ease. Something in the urgency of the voice told me there was something else. I decided to investigate, even though deep down I knew it might be a mistake. The first thing I did was to look for information about the city's best-known tunnels. I found nothing that surprised me. Everything seemed to be on record, from the old cisterns under the old district to the service tunnels that had been abandoned decades ago. However, something didn't add up. There were scattered mentions, vaguely frightening references in old files that spoke of secret tunnels, of a hidden network used in wartime, but no clear details. The mystery was there, but it was not accessible. I decided to take another approach. I toured the city on foot, looking for vestiges of the old infrastructure. I knew that old maps of the city showed a more extensive network of tunnels than was officially spoken of. Some old buildings, those with deep basements, had access to what were referred to as lost passageways. My first stop was a used bookstore, a place I had visited in my youth. The owner, an older man who had been a librarian, seemed to know more than he let on. He took me to a section of the store that had been closed for years. On a secluded shelf, I found an antique book of city maps, published in the early 20th century. Among the yellowed pages, I discovered something interesting, a series of tunnels that were not indicated in the more recent maps. The book detailed a subway network connecting various points in the city, but did not explain its purpose or how it had been used. What was clear was that it had been an extensive network, an active network. I thought the book must be wrong, that it was just one of those urban legends that appear over time. But there was something unsettling about the way the book was bound, the notes in the margins, the crossed-out numbers and markings that suggested someone had been there before, looking for answers. I decided to go to the city library, where I found more references scattered in newspapers from the 1930s. The stories were vague, but they seemed to tell how, during certain periods of political tension, people disappeared and the tunnels became crowded. There were rumors of a secret group using the passages to move around the city undetected. No one seemed to know what had happened to them. The tunnels were eventually sealed, but the disappearances continued. The concept of the secret tunnel network had ceased to be a mere curiosity and had become an obsession. With the information I had gathered, I knew I had to take the next step, go down into those tunnels. At first I thought it might be a dangerous thing to do, but fear turned into a strange need to discover the truth. With a flashlight and a camera, I plucked up my courage and headed for an old building that, according to the plans, was above one of the most important points in the subway network. The place had been a shopping mall in days gone by, but was now disused, with most of the stores closed. The main entrance was locked, but it wasn't hard to find a side door ajar. I walked down a steep staircase, and as soon as I set foot on the ground, I felt a draft of cold air coming from somewhere deeper. At first, everything seemed normal. The walls were brick, and the ceiling was low, which made the feeling of being in a confined space even more intensified. The floor was covered with dirt and debris, but it was clear that it hadn't been there long since someone had been there. Tunnels branched off, some of them clogged with what appeared to be collapsed concrete, others filled with mud or standing water. Each step I took plunged me deeper into the hidden history of the city, a place where time seemed to have stood still. In some sections, the walls had inscriptions from past eras, dates and symbols that I could not decipher. There was something unsettling in the stillness of the place, a sense that the tunnels had been designed to remain forgotten, perhaps even to trap those who ventured to seek them out. As I moved on, I discovered a series of interconnected rooms. The walls were covered with broken wires and rusted machinery, pieces of technology forgotten for generations. Most disconcerting was to find a control room of sorts, with old switches and panels covered in dust. In the center, there was a table with several yellowed documents. As I approached, I could see that they were construction reports, plans of the city, and among them, a notebook with detailed instructions on how to access the deepest parts of the tunnel network. Everything indicated that those passages had not only been used as escape or storage paths. There was something else behind their construction. The report spoke of secret tests, of subway movements to avoid surveillance during times of conflict. It was not just a shelter, but a place where clandestine activities took place, things that the eyes of the world could not see. What had started as an investigation into an old myth was turning into a much darker story. Suddenly I heard a noise. At first I thought it was the creaking of old beams in the tunnel, but then I realized I was not alone. Someone, or something, was moving in the darkness beyond my reach. The sound of footsteps shuffling on the ground made me tense up. Who could be in this abandoned place, in the middle of the night, and why? I decided it was time to leave, but as I moved back into the corridors, I realized that the tunnel I had traveled through did not lead back to the point of entry. The walls seemed to move, and the air became thicker, as if the passages themselves were changing. I walked, disoriented, for what seemed like an eternity, until finally, I came to a fork in the tunnels. There were two paths. One was blocked by fresh debris, but the other seemed to lead to a more open space. Following it, I came to a large room, much larger than I had imagined, filled with heavy machinery and abandoned construction equipment. In the center of the room was a trapdoor in the floor, slightly raised, and as I approached, I discovered a small metal box hidden beneath it. Inside the box, there were a number of old photographs and more documents, all linked to the same secret network of tunnels. The air was getting heavier and heavier, and something inside me told me that I shouldn't go any further. But it was too late. I had unearthed something that I could not bury again. I knew that when I got out of there, nothing would ever be the same again. I walked back to the entrance, finally finding the way out where I had come in. The fresh city air hit my face, but my mind was still trapped in the tunnels. The images and documents I had found were clear evidence that someone had been using those tunnels for a much deeper reason than I had imagined. Since that night, I have continued to investigate, but each clue leads me further into a dead-end maze. What I found is not myth or legend. The tunnels are there, waiting to be discovered, and I know that, like the city that houses them, their secrets will never cease to haunt me. We had been planning this trip for months. After weeks of stress, with work going on and the city in constant noise, we wanted a respite, a secluded place where time would stand still and we could recuperate. Winter had arrived with a vengeance, covering the mountains and forests with a thick layer of snow. We found a small hotel in a remote corner, far from everything, isolated on top of a hill. It seemed to be the perfect thing, the ideal place to disconnect, a refuge where nothing could disturb us. What we didn't know, what we didn't expect, was that this place would change us forever. The road snaked through the forest, covered by the snow that fell uninterruptedly, and the deeper we got into the landscape, the lonelier the journey became. There was something unsettling about the way the snow covered everything in its path, as if trying to erase footprints, to silence the world. My wife, Clara, had been excited all the way, but even she began to show signs of unease when we reached the last stretch of road, a narrow road that seemed to have forgotten civilization. Finally, the hotel appeared before us, shrouded in a thick fog that made its shapes blur. The building was large, of an old and cluttered architecture, with dark wooden windows and a sloping roof covered with snow. It looked like a mansion that had been forgotten by time, as if it did not belong to this world. The place had no lights on the outside, and the atmosphere was so dull that I couldn't help but think that something about the whole thing wasn't right. However, what prompted us to continue was the promise of tranquility and rest. We parked the car by the entrance and made our way to the front door. At first, the welcome was normal, almost cordial. An older man with gray hair and a wrinkled face greeted us at the entrance. His gaze was distant, but his voice was friendly, and he even offered us a glass of wine to welcome us. Clara accepted with a smile, but something in his attitude made me feel uncomfortable. It was as if the man was waiting for someone, as if the whole process of checking us in was already planned in advance. The hotel lobby was spacious, with dust-covered antique furniture and a burning fireplace that didn't seem to heat anything. The walls were adorned with portraits that seemed to follow us with their eyes, but it was impossible to tell if they were real people or just portraits from bygone eras. The air was cold and dry, and the silence was almost palpable, something that puzzled me. There was no sound beyond the crackling of the fire. We were assigned a room on the second floor. The hallway was dark, and the lights flickered on and off. The hotel was strangely empty. There were no other guests, and the only sound we heard was the creaking of the wood under our feet. Clara didn't seem as worried as I was, but the feeling of helplessness, of being in the middle of nowhere, grew stronger as we made our way deeper into the building. Arriving at our room, I was surprised by the lack of heat. The window was partially covered with snow, and the air inside was frigid, as if the cold outside had managed to penetrate to the core of the building. Despite this, the furnishings were luxurious, with a large bed, thick carpet, and heavy curtains that seemed to have been made to stand the test of time. On the wall, an antique clock struck the hours with a sound that echoed strangely in the silence of the room. Clara didn't seem worried. She even began to shed her coat with a smile, as if nothing was out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cold, the silence, that fog enveloping the building, everything seemed designed to keep us trapped in some kind of bubble. I closed the door with a thud, and then the restlessness I had been ignoring until that moment became a constant pressure in my chest. That night, after dinner in the hotel restaurant, a room with empty tables, lit only by chandeliers that barely emitted light, we retired to our room. Dinner was strange, as if the dishes were too elaborate for such an isolated place. The chef, an aged-looking man, approached our table with a forced smile, but we didn't exchange many words. He seemed uninterested in us beyond making sure we ate. The food wasn't bad, but it wasn't something I would remember fondly either. Shortly after we went to bed, the wind began to howl loudly, hitting the windows with an intensity that made me think about how far away we were from the world. The building creaked strangely, as if there was something else in its foundation. Clara, exhausted from the trip, fell asleep quickly, but I couldn't fall asleep. The antique clock on the wall seemed to mark the hours with frightening precision, and the noise of the wind enveloped me in a suffocating atmosphere. It was then that I began to hear the whispers. At first I thought it was the sound of the wind or some draft moving something in the room, but no, the whispers were coming from somewhere inside the hotel. I got out of bed and looked out the window, but the fog was enveloping everything, and I couldn't see more than a few feet. I looked down the hallway from the door, but no one was there. Just silence and darkness. As I returned to bed, my mind began to fill with strange thoughts. I remembered the portraits in the hallway, the paintings that seemed to be watching us, and how the older man had greeted us with a cordiality that was less than sincere. My uneasiness grew, and I got up once more to investigate the hotel. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I went downstairs. The hallway was even darker than before, and the air in the lobby was colder. There were no footprints of anyone, but the floor was covered with an unbroken layer of dust, as if time had stood still. I headed to the back, toward a door I hadn't seen before. It was an old wooden door, hidden in a corner. Something about it caught my attention, a sense that the door held something important, something I needed to see. The handle was cool to the touch, and as I turned it, the door swung open with a groan. What I found on the other side was not a hallway, but an empty room, with a floor covered by a thick layer of dust and cobwebs hanging from the ceiling beams. In the center of the room was a table, on which rested several crumpled papers. I picked them up with trembling hands, and as I looked them over, I discovered that they were handwritten. The messages were disconcerting, fragments of stories that spoke of people trapped, of travelers who never left the hotel, of an owner who had made dark pacts to ensure his permanence in that place. The cold in the room was increasing, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. As I looked toward the door, I saw a shadow at the end of the hallway, a figure moving slowly, and although I could not see its details, its presence chilled my blood. I left the room on impulse, slamming the door behind me with a thud. Back in our room, Clara was still asleep, oblivious to everything. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, unable to get what I had discovered out of my head. Looking at the clock on the wall, I saw that it was already very late. Time in the hotel seemed to be an illusion, and my mind kept turning over the words written on those papers. That night, I could not sleep. The wind kept banging against the windows, and every creak of the building made me think that the hotel was watching us. At dawn, I decided we should leave, but when I went out into the lobby, the older man was waiting for us, as if he knew what had happened. He looked at us with a smile on his face, but his eyes were empty, as if he was no longer there, as if everything we had experienced was part of a script we could not understand. Before we left, he handed me a small key without saying a word. That key, like the hotel, is now locked in a drawer, waiting for someone else to find it. I'll never go back there, but I know I couldn't escape. The hotel is still waiting for me in some corner of memory. I have always been a curious man, one of those who are attracted by the unknown, by forgotten stories and secrets buried under layers of time. Perhaps that was the reason why I accepted the invitation of my friend, Eduardo, to travel to that forgotten city. A city that, he told me, had been suddenly evacuated years ago, and of which no one knew much. No one except him. At first, I thought it was an interesting story, just another rumor among the many that circulate. But when he began to insist with such fervor, I couldn't help but be intrigued. I decided to go. We traveled by car, on lonely roads through arid, mountainous landscapes. The abandoned city was somewhere, in the heart of nowhere, a gray spot on the map that no one visited. Eduardo talked to me about it as if it were a myth, about how it had been a flourishing city during the early years of the 20th century, before everything fell apart. He talked about disappearances, rumors of a plague or some kind of secret experiment gone wrong. But those were all just stories. No one knew for sure. The sun was beginning to set when we arrived. There was no sign of life in the surrounding area. The entrance to the city was guarded by a large, rusty iron gate, as if someone had tried, unsuccessfully, to keep the curious away. As I stepped through the gate, the feeling of entering a place that time had forgotten immediately hit me. The air was strange, thick, as if something was being held back. There was no sound, no birds singing, no wind moving the branches, just absolute silence, absolute emptiness. The streets were deserted, the houses empty. Broken windows peered into a dark interior, covered with the dust and grime of the years. The sidewalks, cracked by the passage of time, gave the sensation that they had not been stepped on in decades. Everything seemed to stand still, waiting for something to happen. But the strangest thing was the way the structures lined up perfectly, almost too perfectly, as if they had been built in an order beyond necessity. Eduardo led me through the deserted streets, telling me about the old stories he had heard about this place. He said it had been a prosperous city, a kind of ideal refuge for the rich and powerful, until one day they all disappeared. No one knew why, not even the authorities. In fact, according to him, there was never an official report of what happened. The city was simply empty, with the inhabitants gone and their homes untouched, as if a great fog had swept everything away. I wasn't sure what to expect, but what I saw left me even more bewildered. We walked through what appeared to be the center of the city, a wide square surrounded by monumental-looking buildings. Each of these buildings had an imposing facade, although the passage of time had left them with a desolate air, as if they were shadows of their former selves. Some of the buildings were so large that it was hard for me to imagine how they could have been inhabited. Others were much closer to what could be considered ruins. Yet they all shared something in common, a sense of abandonment, as if one still could not understand what had happened there. In the center of the square was a fountain, or at least what was left of it. It was completely dry, and the stones surrounding it were covered by a thick layer of dust. But what caught my attention the most was a strange inscription on the stone of the fountain. It was written in a language I could not recognize, something that did not belong to anything I had ever seen before. Eduardo explained to me that some believed that the city had been founded by a cult, and that this inscription was part of some kind of lost ritual. At first, I laughed at the idea, but upon closer inspection, I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was something unsettling about those symbols, something that told me I shouldn't keep looking. We decided to enter one of the nearest buildings. It was a former police station, according to the plans Eduardo had found in his research. The building was in ruins, but it still had some furniture and documents in disarray. The walls, crumbling with the passage of time, revealed a rusted iron structure that creaked in the wind. As we explored, we found a small room in the back, with a locked door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. When we forced it open, we found something I had never imagined, a large subway room, hidden beneath the building. The entrance was blocked by debris, but something inside caught my attention. Eduardo, as if he had been expecting to find something there, did not hesitate to enter first. He descended a metal staircase that, although deteriorated, still looked safe. When I reached the base, the darkness was such that I could not see more than a few meters. I pulled out my flashlight, and the light illuminated something that chilled my blood. On the walls, there were strange marks, as if something had been scratching the surface. They weren't simple scratches. The marks seemed to form patterns, as if someone had been trying to write something, but without words. Suddenly, something made us stop. A sound, faint at first, but then clearer. It was a murmur, as if someone was whispering from deep within the place. I looked at Eduardo, but he was already moving forward, almost crawling towards the source of the sound. I followed, despite the growing discomfort I felt. Something inside me told me that we were touching something we shouldn't be, but it was too late. We arrived at a large subway room, much larger than we had anticipated. In the center of the room, there was a stone table, surrounded by a circle of strange symbols. All around it, there were more markings on the floor, more signs of a presence we could not see. The feeling of cold was unbearable, as if the air had become thick, oppressive. But the strangest thing, what really disturbed me, was what was on the table. There was a series of documents, old, worn by time. But what froze me was the contents. They were full of notes about experiments, genetic experimentation, and most disturbing, the reference to something called the vacuum experiment. At first I couldn't understand what it was about, but as I read on, something inside me began to connect the dots. It seemed that the city had not been abandoned by accident. It had been evacuated, not because of a natural disaster or an epidemic, but because of something much darker. The document spoke of a secret project carried out by a group of scientists who, in their eagerness to create something new, unleashed a force that should never have been released. According to the reports, something had happened in that city, something that caused the inhabitants to disappear, leaving it empty and desolate. Suddenly, a dull thud, like a blow, echoed in the back of the room. It was enough to make my heart stop for a moment. Eduardo, who was at the side of the table, turned immediately. His face paled, and his expression became one of horror. In that instant, I understood that something had changed. The place was no longer the same. Something had awakened. I don't know if it was the place or something else, but what I do know is that the city had been waiting. A shudder ran through my body, and without thinking, I bolted for the stairs, with Eduardo following me in a hurry. The sound behind us grew louder, and it wasn't the wind. Something was there, something we hadn't seen. The deserted city, the city we had explored, was alive somehow. When we finally surfaced, the atmosphere had changed. The sky had darkened completely, and the fog, which had previously lingered on the outskirts, now enveloped the city completely. The entrance to the building seemed more distant than it was, and everything around us became more unreal, as if the city was disintegrating. I never knew exactly what happened next. We hurried out of there, but not before we saw something I still can't explain. In one of the broken windows I saw a figure, blurry but clear, watching us. And in that moment, I knew the city was not empty. Maybe it never was. Now every time I pass near that area, a feeling of oppression comes over me. The city is still there, waiting, silent and empty, but ever watchful. And as I recall those moments, I can't help but wonder what really happened there. Maybe I will never know, or maybe the worst is yet to come. I had been blocked for weeks. I woke up every morning hoping the words would flow, but when I got to my desk, all I found was the same blank page staring at me from the beginning. My fingers moved over the keyboard, but nothing happened. The ideas that had once seemed endless and exciting now faded as quickly as shadows at dawn. I was a writer without stories, an empty man. I had begun my writing career years ago, with the same passion and energy as any young man who dreams of making his mark in the literary world. My first books were received with praise, although I was not a phenomenon, but I made a living from what I loved. The contracts, the promotions, the applause, everything was enough to keep my soul satisfied. But as time went by, everything changed. Contracts began to dwindle, ideas became scarce, and criticism became harsher. No one said it openly, but I felt it. My best moment had passed. The block came without warning, like a silent illness, a shadow that loomed over my mind and took over my every thought. I tried everything to recover. Long walks around the city, endless readings of the great classics, but nothing seemed to work. I was trapped in a void from which I didn't know how to escape. And then, something strange happened. One rainy afternoon, when despair was already beginning to weigh on me like too great a burden, I decided to leave the house. I didn't have a destination in mind, but I needed to clear my head, to escape from the walls of my apartment that were beginning to close in on me. I walked through the soggy streets, window shopping, wandering aimlessly, until my steps led me to a bookstore in a forgotten corner of the city. It was no ordinary bookstore, but a small, old-fashioned store that seemed to have been left behind by time. The door creaked open, and a thick air of dust and old paper enveloped me as I entered. The shelves, filled with leather-bound books, looked like something out of another era. It was not a place you would go to by chance. Everything there invited stillness and mystery. I decided to enter. I didn't expect to find anything that really interested me, but something in that atmosphere attracted me. I walked among the bookshelves, touching the worn covers of the books, looking for some spark of inspiration. And then, in a dark corner, behind a pile of abandoned books, I saw it. The manuscript was there, hidden in an aged wooden box. It was no ordinary book. It had no title on the cover, not a single clue to reveal its origin. The box was almost hidden, covered by dust, but something about it caught my attention. I took it in my hands, feeling a shiver run down my spine. The leather covering the box was worn, but when I opened it, I found something even more intriguing. A notebook with yellowed pages, with writing that didn't look human, as if it had been written with thick, dark ink. I couldn't help but touch it. It was as if the notebook itself was calling me, whispering to me to open it, to read it. I took it to the counter without asking any questions, without even questioning why I was so attracted to that object. The old woman behind the counter stared at me with eyes that seemed older than time itself. She said nothing, just nodded as I paid. When I left the store, I felt that the air had changed, that something had altered inside me. That notebook was no longer just an object. It had become something else, something I didn't understand, but that I knew I had to discover. That same night, at home, I began to read it. The ink the original author had used was dark, with tints of red and black, and the words seemed written with a frantic urgency. But what puzzled me most were the opening lines, written chaotically, as if someone had been running away from something. I have made a mistake that will change everything I am, everything I will be. I cannot stop it. I cannot undo what has been done. No one will be able to understand what I have unleashed, but I must write it down. I must record this, so that when the end comes, someone may understand. Those words, written with palpable desperation, left me with an uncomfortable feeling. Despite this, I read on. Each page absorbed me more, as if the notebook had a life of its own. The words flowed into my mind like running water, filling me with images, with scenes I could not fully comprehend. It was as if the author was trapped in a spiral, searching for answers as he wrote. But at the same time, he was as lost as I was. As I read on, the fragments of the manuscript became more obscure and complex. The story told of a writer, much like me, who had fallen into a creative block so deep that his life began to fall apart. Desperation had driven him to search for something more, something beyond what could be grasped. It was then that he discovered something that would change his life. An ancient object, a notebook similar to the one I was holding, that contained the answers to all his problems. But the answers were not what he expected. The writing in the notebook became more and more erratic, more and more frantic. The author spoke of having found a power that had consumed him completely, a power that gave him an extraordinary ability to write, but at a terrible cost. The more he wrote, the deeper he plunged into darkness. The words not only flowed, they seemed to overflow from his mind, taking on a life of their own. The characters he had created came into existence, and the worlds he had invented began to crumble, merging with reality. I paused for a moment, feeling a pressure in my chest. The story of the manuscript was beginning to resonate with me in an alarming way. Was this what had happened to me? Had I found something that would allow me to write, but would drag me into an abyss? I decided to continue, unable to put it down, as if an invisible force was pushing me on. The writer of the manuscript mentioned that, in the end, he could no longer distinguish whether what he was writing was fact or fiction. The characters in his stories began to interact with him, appearing in his dreams, and eventually, in his daily life. He felt haunted by what he had created. The line between what he had invented and what was real had vanished. He could no longer control what he wrote, and the words, like living entities, had claimed him. It was at that point that something in me began to change. The fear that had been growing inside me became a visceral unease. My mind clouded over, and I began to feel that the very words I was reading were not just a story, but a warning. My blockage, the despair I had felt for so long, seemed to have completely disappeared. Suddenly, the words began to emerge, one after another, filling my thoughts with stories, with images, with characters. The ideas were flowing like never before, so fast that I almost couldn't write them down fast enough. It was as if something inside me had been unlocked, as if the notebook had given me access to an endless source of creativity. But as I wrote, I also felt something else, something I couldn't explain. A strange feeling that I was not alone. The characters that emerged from my mind were not just ideas. They were presences. I could hear them, feel them. Sometimes I even thought I saw them at the edge of my vision, like distorted shadows vanishing into thin air. And with every word I wrote, that feeling intensified. In a moment of utter confusion, I stopped and looked down at the notebook. The last page I had written was empty, but the words were beginning to form on their own, without my dictating them. At first, they were just scribbles, but soon they became coherent sentences, full paragraphs. A shiver ran down my spine. I was no longer writing. It was the notebook writing through me. The words continued to flow uncontrollably, and with each word, I felt my life begin to fall apart. My mind was dissolving into these stories, and what was real was beginning to fade away, leaving room only for what I had created. But I could no longer stop. The notebook had caught me, and now I could do nothing but keep writing. The manuscript had served its purpose. It had freed me from my block, but at a much greater cost. I was no longer conscious of whether what I was living was real, if I was real. My name is Javier Salazar, and I'm a criminologist. My work is a delicate, complicated, and above all, obscure field. My task is none other than to study criminal minds, unravel their motivations, and predict their next moves. I have worked with the police on several complex cases, but never before have I been confronted with something as insidious, as disturbing as what I am now investigating. The case began like any other. At first, the news seemed unimportant. A body turned up in a quiet neighborhood with no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, nothing to indicate a violent death. It was a woman, in her 40s, known in the neighborhood for her discretion. There seemed to be no reason for anyone to harm her. The police found nothing, except for a small detail that at first glance went unnoticed, a precise cut on her wrist, as if someone had been waiting for the exact moment to inflict the damage. The murder was attributed to a poorly executed robbery, and the case was quickly shelved. But it wasn't long before another body turned up. The same scene, the same modus operandi, the same precision. A woman, another woman in her 40s, dead under the same circumstances. No one understood what was going on. Then, the police called for help. My task was simple: profile the killer. It wasn't the first time I had worked on a murder case, but there was something different about this one. Something strange that made me dive deeper than ever before. The two murders seemed to be mere coincidences, But when the details fell into place, when the connection became clearer, I knew I was not looking at a common case. The first thing I did was analyze the reports. The lack of signs of a struggle, the absence of extreme violence, the meticulousness with which the crimes had been committed. The killer was not seeking revenge or out of an irrational need for blood. He was calculating, observing, waiting for the perfect moment. There was something methodical in the way he acted, as if he was enjoying a macabre game in which he himself was the master. As I analyzed the details, I noticed an even more disturbing pattern. Both women were found in the same situation. Both were naked, with a small cut on the wrist, and the blood, in both cases, had slowly drained away. It was not an act of uncontrol, but of patience. A killer who knew exactly what he was doing. I began to build a profile in my mind. The killer was not someone impulsive. He wasn't targeting these women at random. He wasn't committing the crimes because he was lost in a state of blind rage. Everything pointed to a meticulous, calculating man. Probably middle-aged, with a keen intelligence, but at the same time, a deep emptiness inside him. This was not a hate crime or an act of unbridled passions. It was the product of a cold, calculating mind. My first analyses pointed to a man with a need for control. A man who saw himself as superior, as someone who had to impose his will on his environment. And he did it in such a precise way that he left no traces. The police had not found a single trace that could identify him. There were no traces of blood, no fibers, nothing to link him to the crime scene. But something told me that the killer was getting closer and closer to his target. Somehow, I could sense that the next murders were already on their way. And when they came, it was not a surprise, but a confirmation. The pattern repeated itself. Another woman, again in her 40s, again with no sign of a struggle. The only thing that had changed was the location. This time, the victim was found in a secluded park, on the shore of a small lake. The killer was trying something new, but the essence of the crime remained intact. The women had no connection to each other, at least not to the naked eye. They all lived relatively normal lives, with no obvious problems. Some had families, others lived alone. But there was one thing that united them. They all seemed to have been chosen at random, for no reason. Or at least that's what the detectives thought. I wasn't so sure. I could no longer believe in coincidences. There was something else behind it all, something I couldn't yet see. The killer wasn't looking for random women. He was selecting people who fit a specific type of profile. The pattern was starting to become clearer. The women didn't just share age or the fact that they were alone. There was more to it. They were women who felt trapped, women who were somehow looking for something more in their lives. Some were in crisis. Others had been unable to get out of their routine for years. The killer wasn't just killing them. He was freeing them, albeit in his own twisted way. Little by little, I began to understand what was happening. The killer was not just killing. He wasn't just seeking revenge or exerting control. He was looking for something deeper. Each killing was an act of desperation, a need to find something in the darkness. For him, killing was not just a means to assert his power, but a way to connect with something he could not otherwise reach. He was looking for someone who understood him, who shared his emptiness. But who was this man? What had brought him to this point? My research led me to discover a series of events in his life that left me speechless. A man with a past as broken as that of the victims he had chosen. He had grown up in a dysfunctional family, with an absentee mother and an abusive father. From a young age, he had learned to hide his emotions, to protect himself from a world he didn't understand. His adult life had not been much better. He had been a lonely man, without friends, without connections. No one had understood him. No one had seen his suffering. His mind had slowly deteriorated, step by step, as his need for control and power took over. And when he began to commit the murders, he felt more alive than ever. In every cut, in every sacrifice, he found a small spark of solace. But that was never enough. What terrified me most was that this man did not see his victims as human beings. He didn't see them as women who had lives of their own, dreams and desires. He saw them as pieces of a puzzle, pieces that he needed to fit into his worldview. He was a killer who not only killed, but destroyed reality itself, creating a new narrative that only he could understand. The police began to feel the pressure. The killings wouldn't stop. The killer was toying with us, leaving us behind, making a mockery of our investigations. But what they didn't know, what I understood, was that he was close to his ultimate goal. The profile I had created in my mind was almost complete. The killer was a man on the last rung of his decline. All that was left was one last murder. And then, I would know everything. The investigation continued for weeks, but something inside me told me that time was running out. People were beginning to suspect that the killer was following a routine. Maybe he was looking for someone in particular. Maybe the time had come to end it all. As the pressure mounted, I began to feel the same sense of tension as the killer, the sense that something terrible was about to happen. The last victim appeared in an abandoned hospital, a place that had been closed for years. When I arrived at the site, I understood everything. It was not only a symbolic place for the killer, but a place that represented what he had been looking for. The emptiness, the darkness. And at that moment, looking at the corpse, I knew I had reached the end of my investigation. I had understood who the killer was, and although I had profiled him perfectly, I realized that I could never fully understand the madness that had driven this man to commit his crimes. In the end, the killer was apprehended, but for me, the case was never over. The emptiness, the broken mind, the broken soul, all of it remained with me, like a shadow. I couldn't help but wonder, what is in the mind of a man who goes to such lengths? What is it that drives him to seek something he doesn't even know how to describe? And above all, how many more like him exist in the shadows? My name is Samuel Dubois, and I was one of the first to believe that human cloning could change the course of history. It wasn't just a scientific question for me. It was deeper, more personal. The search for immortality, for a way to leave a mark that would transcend the simple passage of time. From a young age, I dreamed of the possibility of creating something as perfect as my own image, something that would replace me, that would take my ideas beyond what I could achieve in a lifetime. The laboratory in which I worked was my sanctuary, isolated from the noise of the world, surrounded by state-of-the-art equipment and advanced documentation on genetics and molecular biology. For years, my team and I struggled to understand DNA, to decipher its mysteries. The first attempts were shaky. The results were not what we expected. The creatures we created did not survive beyond the first few weeks. But each failure brought me closer to the answer. Human cloning had been a distant dream. Many considered it impossible, illegal, or immoral, but I was not like others. I had reached a point where the rules of ethics didn't concern me as much. My obsession was greater than the awareness of the consequences. What is morality when you are trying to achieve something as fundamental as perpetuity? I didn't understand it then, and eventually I stopped trying to understand it. Finally, I got what I had been looking for. One day, exactly 3 years ago, I did it. The first human clone. My clone. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were flaws, inconsistencies in its growth, small mutations that could have been foreseen, but all in the context of what we had done, it was a monumental achievement, a breakthrough, a step toward something even greater. The day I first saw my other self, a sense of triumph came over me. He was living evidence that science can overcome the limits of nature, that it could create something that was not human, but had the appearance, consciousness, and intellect of a human being. My own face, my own gestures, my own thoughts. Only it was him, and not me. A mirror, but with life. At first, everything seemed to go well. I called him D1, for double. He was almost identical to me. Every feature, every movement, every way of thinking was accurately reflected. But as the weeks passed, small differences began to emerge. D1 was not a simple reflection of my being. He had his own ideas, his own impulses, and most disconcerting, he looked at me in a way that made me feel uncomfortable, as if I were observing a stranger. At first, I tried to ignore him. I told myself it was all part of the process. What else could I expect from a being that had just been created? Biology is not exact, after all. But something was beginning to gnaw at my insides. Every time I looked at him, there was something in his gaze that made me deeply uneasy, as if he was self-conscious in a way that shouldn't be possible. I began to wonder if my clone really saw me as his creator, or if, on the contrary, he considered me a kind of inferior being, a mere step in his own evolution. The days began to get stranger and stranger. D1 became more interested in the world outside the lab. He began to ask questions about what it meant to live, what freedom implied, what it meant to be something. My answers were vague, almost mechanical. I was creating a being that, despite having my own intellect, did not have the same context as me, did not possess my history, my memories, my experiences. It was just an empty vessel, an imperfect copy of what I was. But as the weeks passed, D1's questions became deeper, more philosophical. He began to talk about the meaning of his existence, about his purpose. His growing curiosity puzzled me. How could a newborn being ask such questions? Where did this restlessness come from? One day I found myself watching him while reading one of my scientific investigations. The way he handled the book, how he studied it, how he made connections in his mind, reminded me so much of myself in my early days as a researcher. It was as if I was reviewing my own thoughts, but from a completely new perspective, a perspective that did not belong to me. It was then that I realized something. D1 was not just a reflection of me. He was a distorted, but at the same time independent version of who I was. Something inside him had changed, something I hadn't planned. He had begun to develop an autonomy, a consciousness that went beyond what I had designed. And with that autonomy came the inevitable question: what would he do with his own life? What did it mean to be a clone, if you are not able to understand yourself? The answer was not long in coming. One morning I found my lab in shambles. Samples were all over the floor, equipment in disarray, screens turned off. The chaos was total. I approached the table where D1 usually worked. There, among the scattered papers, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A series of notes he had left, as if they were a kind of testament. But they were not words, not conventional phrases. They were calculations, formulas, equations describing something. Something I didn't understand. A scheme. A plan. It was as if D1 was trying to create something else. Something that was not limited only to his own existence. I began to review the documents more closely, and I slowly realized that my clone had been working on a side project. He wasn't just interested in his origin, but in something much deeper. How to create a version of himself that could transcend the limits of his own nature. He was creating a new way of life. I wanted to do more than just be my reflection. I wanted to evolve. My clone had developed independent thinking that I had never anticipated. The creature I had created, this reflection of myself, was not interested in being a replica. It wanted to transcend the limits imposed by its own existence, as if it were searching for something that would uniquely define it, something that would separate it from me. I was overcome with a mixture of fear and fury. What I had created was not just a human being. It was something more complex, more dangerous, more unpredictable. It had been a machine that imitated perfectly, but now it seemed to want to transform itself into something completely different. It was no longer a clone. It was an individual with its own thoughts, its own agenda. What began as an experiment to confirm the possibility of cloning had evolved into something I could not control. At first, I tried to look for him, but D1 was no longer in the lab. He had left the place. He had disappeared. My mind was in despair. Where could he be? What had he done with the resources I had left at his disposal? What purpose was he pursuing now? And above all, how could I stop him if his intelligence exceeded mine? The situation worsened when I realized that I was not alone in the world. I had begun to receive strange visits from people who knew my work, but could not have learned it in a conventional way. It seemed that D1 had begun to build a network, a plan that went beyond the walls of the lab. He had not only copied my memories, my intellect, but also my failures, my fears, my despair. And that made him unpredictable. With each passing day, the feeling that my creation, my clone, was becoming something greater than me surrounded me more strongly. I had created a new life, but I was no longer sure who was really in charge of it. Was D1 just an extension of my being, or had it become something completely alien to me? My history, my existence, was being rewritten in real time, and I could no longer predict what would happen next. What had begun as an attempt to conquer immortality had become a race against the clock to keep my own identity intact. In the process, I began to wonder if someday, at some point, everything I had done, everything I had accomplished, would simply be absorbed by my own reflection, by this clone that now roamed the world with a life of its own. And worst of all, I didn't know if he was looking for me, or if I was the one who should be looking for him. My name is Marco Serrano. I never imagined that my life would take the course it has taken. It was not a sudden change, nor a sharp turn. It was more like a slow infiltration, an imperceptible slippage from what at first seemed a trivial capacity into something much deeper, much more disturbing. And of course, it was not something I could have foreseen. The visions began without warning, and since then, my life has become a complicated game of chess, where the pieces move before I even decide on the next move. It all started one ordinary afternoon, when I didn't expect anything to change. I had spent the day in my office as usual, solving reports and managing the small crises of each day. My life, on the surface, was normal. There was nothing to foresee what was about to happen. That afternoon, for no apparent reason, an image struck me. The vision was fleeting, a flash in my mind, but enough to make me stop. I saw a building, a place I recognized immediately, even though I hadn't been there in years. I saw a group of people, about 3 or 4, in some kind of desperate struggle. I remember the feeling of discomfort, a tightness in my chest, as if I knew something horrible was about to happen, but without being able to fully comprehend what. My breathing accelerated, my pulse shot up, and for an instant, everything around me vanished. The vision lasted only a few seconds, but when I came back to reality, I felt a shiver down my back. I didn't understand what had just happened. I thought maybe I had been too stressed, or perhaps mental fatigue had played a trick on me. However, something inside me kept telling me that this vision had not been a simple mistake of my mind. There was something palpable in it, something that told me that it was not a figment of my imagination. That same night, when I got home, I decided to forget about it. I tried to think that maybe I had been under too much pressure at work, that the stress had altered my mind somehow. But as I tried to sleep, the image reappeared. This time it was clearer. I saw the building again, but this time I could see details. The structure, the color of the walls, the exact place where it stood. I couldn't get it out of my head. There was something about that image that I couldn't let go. The next day I decided to go investigate. I drove to the place I had seen in my vision. I was in an industrial area of the city, away from the hustle and bustle and tourist spots. The building was an old factory, almost abandoned, with a gloomy air that looked like something out of a thriller. I wasn't sure what I expected to find there, but I felt an inexplicable pressure, as if the image of my vision had dragged me to that place. Upon arrival, I couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. Everything matched what I had seen in my mind. Every corner, every broken window, the peeling paint, the deterioration of the place. Everything was just as I had imagined it. A feeling of anxiety came over me, but curiosity was stronger. I walked around the building, trying to discover something that would justify the vision, but all I found were more questions. Something told me that wasn't the answer, but I also knew there was something important there. The vision repeated itself intermittently over the next few days. Sometimes the images were of small objects, sometimes of conversations I didn't fully understand. I saw a heated argument in a coffee shop, a traffic accident at a distant intersection. In each vision, the same feeling of urgency. There was always a sense that if I didn't do something, something terrible would happen. Most disturbing of all, as the visions repeated, the clarity increased. I could see the faces of the people involved, their gestures, the words they spoke, as if I were witnessing scenes from a movie being recorded in my mind. But the worst thing was not the content of the visions. It was the feeling of inevitability, as if things were already happening, as if I had no power over them. My life began to change. At first I tried to go about my routine to ignore the images that assaulted me, but soon I realized that the visions were not just memories or fragments of fantasy. They were premonitions. What I saw in my mind would somehow occur with frightening accuracy. I saw the traffic accident I mentioned earlier, and it happened exactly as I had seen it. I saw the discussion in the coffee shop, and it happened in the same place, with the same words. However, the most disturbing vision was the one that took place one rainy afternoon when I saw a woman on a lonely street, running for her life. I didn't know who she was, but I clearly saw that something was chasing her. The vision had no clear details, but the sense of danger was so palpable that I couldn't stop thinking about her. I decided to act. I started tracking the people I had visions of to see if I could stop what I saw before it happened. Of course, this led me into strange situations, and I often found myself asking nonsensical questions. A couple of times I was even ignored or dismissed in disbelief. But what bothered me most was what I could not foresee. There were times when, as I tried to intervene, something would change slightly, as if the pieces of the puzzle were readjusting. That gave me false hope. I told myself that maybe, if I intervened in time, I could alter the future. But it was an illusion. The visions kept coming, and whatever happened in them, no matter how hard I tried to avoid it, happened. The first time I really felt the weight of my visions was when I saw an accident. I saw a man fall from a scaffold on a construction site. It was clear in my vision, but there was something strange. I knew exactly where and at what time it would happen. I decided to go to the site, hoping I could avoid it. When I arrived, I saw the man working on the scaffolding. My heart was pounding, and sweat began to bead on my forehead. I knew that if I didn't intervene, the accident would happen. However, something stopped me. The vision did not show me how to prevent it. What I saw was a static image, a sequence of events that could not be altered. The man fell, and I saw it in my mind before it happened. I went to his side as fast as I could, but it was too late. I found him lying on the ground, his body inert, blood mixed with the earth. I didn't know what to do. The feeling of helplessness hit me hard. The vision had come true, just as I had seen it, and I'd been unable to do anything to stop it. After that day, my visions became more intense. I saw not only the near future, but also the distant, confused future. Sometimes I saw events that I would never understand, others that seemed to make no sense. He saw the faces of unknown people, of places he did not know, of situations he did not understand. Some visions were clear, others hazy, but all carried with them the same sense of inevitability. I found myself trapped in a maze from which I could not escape. The more I tried to change the future, the more I became convinced that the future was written in advance, and that I could do nothing to alter it. Anxiety devoured me, and I began to isolate myself from others. My life, which had once seemed to be under my control, had now become a collection of pieces of a puzzle that had already been put together, and I was only playing the role of observer. There is no way of knowing when the next vision will come or what meaning it will have. There are days when I wake up with the feeling that the future is near, that I am about to see something else, something that will change everything. But in the end, everything remains the same. The visions don't leave me alone. The future keeps coming, and I am just a spectator. A spectator who, sooner or later, will have to accept that there is no escape from what has already been written. The Valverde Mansion is not a common place, neither for its size nor for its history. Few dare to approach it. The first times I passed by it at the time of my usual walk, it seemed to me just a large, old, and somewhat desolate building, like so many other old buildings that, over time, are crumbling little by little. Its broken windows, its withered garden, and its aged stone facade did not convey anything special to me. But that door, that closed door, always closed, watched me from the corner of my mind. It kept me intrigued, as if a small invisible thread was pulling me towards it. My name is Enrique Ramos, and I am a man who is often attracted to the hidden, the unspoken, what is hidden behind the walls of normality. I live in a small apartment in the city, far from conveniences, but close to everything that is needed for a quiet life. However, my daily routine of writing and reading has not prevented me from noticing, again and again, that closed door. The Valverde Mansion was built over 100 years ago and was located in one of the most secluded areas of the city. No one knew much about its history, nor who its first inhabitants were, but rumors have always surrounded the place. They said that the Valverde family had been wealthy, influential, and that after a tragic event, it had been left uninhabited, without heirs, and lifeless. Neighbors claimed that the house was the scene of not only family tragedies, but also personal ones, as if something macabre had been incubating within its walls for generations. Some spoke of a sealed door at the back of the mansion, hidden behind the gardens and behind the surrounding brush, but no one had ever come close enough to see if these stories were true. The first time I heard about the locked door was at the cafe where I usually go to write, a secluded place where the old men of the neighborhood used to gather. They had been discussing the Valverde Mansion, and in particular, the door that no one could open. No one seemed to know what was behind it, but everyone seemed to have their own theory about it. Some said it was a secret passageway to a hidden treasure. Others, more superstitious, spoke of something much darker, a place where the Valverde family had committed a crime so heinous that the door itself had been locked to prevent evil from being released. Be that as it may, the closed door had become a mythical figure in the neighborhood. For weeks, that door became my obsession. I couldn't help but think about it, what it might hide, what it didn't want to show to the world. I wondered if those rumors were just an invention of the old people, or if there was something else, something real behind it all. One day, after several days of fruitless reading, I decided that I had to investigate on my own. I was not a reckless young man, but I felt that curiosity was consuming me. Maybe it was just a sealed door, a forgotten piece of wood, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was waiting for me there. I decided to go one afternoon. I made the decision that it would be better to do it when no one was around anymore. The Valverde Mansion was isolated and uninhabited, but I didn't want to be seen, not out of fear, but out of an inexplicable desire to keep the intrigue intact. I walked there after finishing my day's work. The sun was beginning to set, and the golden afternoon light covered the house with a yellowish glow. As I got closer, my steps became slower, and my breathing deeper. I couldn't stop thinking about the closed door. When I reached the back garden, the first thing I noticed was the weeds, which had already covered almost the entire entrance. I moved forward carefully, pushing aside the dry branches and climbing plants that were growing out of control. The gate was there, as large and as imposing as ever. The wood was weathered by the passage of time, but it looked undamaged. It had no visible locks or padlocks, but something told me it was not a door that could be easily opened. As I approached, I saw that there was a crack in the frame, a small opening, as if at some point it had been forced. My first impulse was to walk away, to leave everything behind, but I did not. The door was calling me. Something inside me told me that if I didn't open it, I would never find peace. I looked around, but there was no one around. I was all alone. I took a breath, reached out, and with a trembling hand, pushed the door. It moved easily, and the sound of the wooden frame sliding over the surface seemed much louder than I had imagined. On the other side, I found no passage to a basement, no forgotten room, as I had first imagined. There was no dust or cobwebs, nothing abandoned. Instead of a dark, sealed space, what I found was a perfectly preserved room. Everything was in its place. Antique furniture, tapestries that hadn't frayed, a lamp that still seemed to work. Everything was surprisingly well kept, as if someone had been there recently, though it couldn't have been. What struck me most was the center of the room. There was a wooden table, as if it were a workplace. On the table, a stack of aged papers lay neatly organized, as if they had been left there for someone to read. Around the table, several chairs appeared to be set up for a meeting. There was nothing outwardly strange, but there was something unsettling about the atmosphere in the room. It was as if time had been standing still in that room, but not just in the physical sense, but emotionally as well. I approached the table and began to examine the papers. The first one I picked up contained nothing comprehensible. It was blank, but when I turned it over, I noticed that there were subtle marks on the back, as if someone had left some kind of message in the form of a code. The next thing that caught my eye was a lighter document, a leather notebook closed with a string. I untied it and opened it cautiously. The pages were full of annotations, names, dates, and places that I did not recognize. There was something very strange in those writings, something that did not leave me at ease. Each page seemed more disturbing than the last. What I read there left me frozen. The notes spoke of a very old family, the Valverdes, and of an event that occurred in the mansion more than half a century ago. According to the notes, the family had experienced a series of tragedies, but what struck me most was the mention of a last will that was to be fulfilled, a final testament that had never been executed. According to the notebook, the door had been locked because therein lay a secret so dark that no one was to know about it. The family had been involved in something far more sinister than the rumors hinted at, a pact with unknown interests that had led them to commit terrible acts, unthinkable to anyone who didn't know the real story. As I turned the pages, the air in the room grew thicker, heavier. Somehow, I felt as if I was entering dangerous territory, as if I had already touched something I should never have touched. I knew I had to get out, but something inside me told me I had to keep digging. Each page drew me deeper into the mystery. Something was gripping me. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a faint rustling, as if someone had stepped on the floor. I turned quickly, but there was nothing and no one. The room was empty, or so it seemed. However, as I looked back down at the table, I saw that something had changed. The notebook was no longer where I had left it. Desperate, I began to search the room, looking for the cause of my growing paranoia. But all I found were the traces of my own footsteps in the dust on the floor. Finally, I understood that the closed door was not just a physical obstacle. It was a threshold to something much bigger and more dangerous. What was behind that door was not just a secret. It was a warning. What I found in that room changed everything I thought I knew about the mansion, about the Valverdes, and about my own curiosity. As I left, I closed the door behind me, but it was too late. Something had been unearthed, and I could not undo what I had started. I have always been a man of habit. I don't consider myself a superstitious person, but when something repeats with clockwork precision, one begins to wonder if there is something beyond mere coincidence. Over the years, I have cultivated a quiet life, where every day has its purpose and every hour its place. My work, my routines, everything fell into place with an almost military rigor. Everything seemed to be perfectly synchronized, like the gears of an antique clock. But that day, everything changed. And not because of something big or spectacular, but because of something that, at the time, seemed to me to be just a distraction. Something so small that I could not grasp at the time the magnitude of what was about to happen. It was an ordinary morning, one of those when the sun filtered timidly through the clouds and the fresh city air caressed my skin as I left my apartment. There was something about the quietness of those days that I found especially comforting. My alarm clock went off at 7 o'clock a.m. as usual, and within minutes I was in my small kitchen making coffee while checking email. Everything was in place, in the exact sequence I used to follow every morning, but something wasn't right. When I looked at the wall clock, I noticed that the second hand had stopped moving. This was not unusual for an old clock like mine, but something about its stillness caught my attention. It wasn't simply a small jam. Something inside me told me that this was a detail I shouldn't ignore. I approached the clock, watched it for a few more seconds, and decided to wind it, as I had done many times before. As I did so, something strange happened. The second hand did not move, not even when I turned the key. As if it was trapped in an invisible place, as if time itself had been suspended. I didn't think much of it because my life went on. The wall clock was just one of the many objects that populated my home. I had important appointments that day, and punctuality was crucial. But somewhere in the back of my mind, something was telling me that I should pay attention to that little incident. The clock was stopped, but the rest of the world was moving on. Or so it seemed. What I didn't know at the time was that this simple incident would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would change my life completely. Throughout the morning, everything seemed to go on as usual. I went to the office, attended some meetings, reviewed reports. However, as the day progressed, I noticed something strange in the atmosphere. Every time I looked at the clock on my desk, the hands seemed to stop for an instant. It wasn't a prolonged stop, just a flicker, as if time itself was wavering. I would look at it, and when I refocused, the hands were already moving. At first I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but then I saw it more than once. It was not a mistake, not a matter of perception. Something was happening, but I couldn't explain it. At 3 o'clock p.m., I was sitting in front of a screen, writing a report when it happened. It wasn't a flicker or a small mismatch, but a resounding event, like a thump on the desk. The clock on my desk stopped. Everything stopped. Not just the clock, but the sound around me. The hum of computers, the murmur of conversations in the hallway. Even the air seemed to have stopped. The whole world fell into absolute silence. A silence so heavy that I found it impossible to breathe, as if time had decided to freeze at that exact moment. I tried to move, but my hands were still, as if an invisible wall prevented me from doing so. I looked around me, searching for a rational explanation, but the other employees remained motionless at their desks, as if they were statues, as if time had ceased to exist for them too. My mind was beginning to panic. Was it possible that it was me who was experiencing something out of the ordinary? A blackout? A hallucination? No, it wasn't that. I was conscious. I felt the weight of my body, the air in my lungs. But time was standing still. The clock on my desk was still there, its hands frozen, unable to move, as if they were watching me with a fixed, accusing gaze. Silence enveloped me, crushed me. There was nothing around me that could change the situation. I felt my heart beating in my ears, and in that instant I understood that somewhere deep inside me, I was trapped in a time bubble. A bubble that had stopped everything but me. I don't know how much time passed because the notion of time no longer existed. I couldn't see or feel anything to tell me that things would go on. I didn't know if seconds, minutes, or hours passed. When stillness was finally replaced by movement, the clock started ticking again, as if nothing had happened. The hands moved again, but the sensation of what I had experienced remained etched in me, like a shadow that refused to fade. When I came to, the bustle of the office had returned. People were moving again, computers were humming, the sound of air conditioning filled the room. Everything seemed to be back to normal, but inside I knew something had changed. something was altered. Worst of all was not the experience itself, but the fact that I could find no logical explanation. I searched through my medical files, through books on neurological diseases, but nothing seemed to fit. I was completely alone with my experience, and every attempt to find an answer only left me more confused. That night, upon returning home, I tried to evade the thoughts that plagued me. I told myself that maybe it had been a stressful episode, that my mind had played a practical joke. But when I got to my apartment and looked at the wall clock, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The clock was stopped again, just as it had been that morning. And not only that, all the clocks in my home were stopped. The clock in my kitchen, the clock in the bathroom, the clock in the living room. Everything was still, and this time, I couldn't move. I stared at the clocks, unable to comprehend what was happening. My first impulse was to change the batteries, to think maybe it was a malfunction, but something stopped me. The feeling of being trapped in a place I didn't understand, a sense of helplessness, made me hesitate. I could no longer ignore what was happening. It wasn't about broken clocks or malfunctions. Something much bigger was at stake. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the stopped clocks, as a terrifying thought began to form in my mind. It wasn't time that had stopped, it was me. It was as if the universe had stopped everything around me, leaving my consciousness intact, but a prisoner of an eternal instant. An instant that I did not know if it had stopped forever, or if, as before, the flow of time would start again at any moment, but in an irreparable way. Weeks passed, and the phenomenon did not occur again with the same intensity, but every time I looked at a clock, I felt a pressure in my chest, as if I were on the edge of a truth that I could not understand. What I experienced that day, that feeling of absolute suspension, of time standing still, did not go away. It was with me, lurking in every corner of my life. I could not stop thinking about it. Sometimes, when I look at the clock in my office, I feel that time stops again, although the second hand keeps moving. Maybe it never stops. Maybe it's me who is trapped in an endless cycle, in a bubble of time that I can't control, but that is always there, lurking. The clocks stop, and time seems suspended. But perhaps, what really stops is oneself. There was something unsettling in the air that afternoon. A kind of heaviness, as if time itself were suspended. It was not something tangible, but I felt it in every corner of the house, as if the walls themselves were breathing slowly, trapping my thoughts and transforming them into a tangle of doubts. The house was empty, as was my life in those days. The boxes I had not yet opened since I moved in a couple of weeks ago were still stacked on the floor, like vestiges of a past I was reluctant to remember. It was an old apartment, located in an out-of-the-way part of town, a place that, at one time, was perhaps elegant, but over the years had fallen into oblivion. The floor creaked under my feet. The windows were covered by curtains of a gray that seemed from another time. It was the kind of place where one did not expect anything important to happen. Loneliness was in every corner. I had moved there for a reason I dare not explore too much. To escape. To escape the noise, the unanswered questions my life had begun to ask me. Work kept me busy, but the restlessness was always there. My former life seemed like a distant dream, blurry and alien, but with each passing day, the shadows of that past returned. I was aware that nothing is ever really forgotten. The past follows people, like a silent ghost. One day, while reorganizing boxes in the storage room, I found an old photograph. It was crumpled, slightly yellowed by the passage of time. The edge was bent in several places, as if someone had hastily put it away at some point. It wasn't just any old photo. It looked up at me from the paper with a strange familiarity, as if it knew me better than I knew myself. The picture showed a group of people, some of whom I failed to identify immediately. They were standing in front of what looked like an old mansion, a dark stone building covered in moss. The photo looked like it was taken at some point in the late 19th or early 20th century. The faces of the men and women were serious, as if an invisible weight was pressing down on their chests. None of them were smiling. The atmosphere in the image was cold, as if the air itself had frozen the faces of those posing for the camera. But the most disturbing thing was the figure in the background, barely visible, something that was not immediately apparent, but that as soon as I noticed it made my blood run cold. On the far right of the photo, barely visible in the shadows of a tree, a figure could be made out. It was a man, but he was not well defined. His face was distorted, as if it had been torn from the rest of the photo, as if it were out of place. I couldn't tell if it was an illusion caused by the wear and tear of the image or something else. What was certain was that he didn't fit in. It didn't fit the group. It didn't fit the context. It didn't fit the time. What disturbed me most was the sense of familiarity I felt when I saw that figure. I couldn't remember ever having seen that man before, but in some corner of my mind, something told me I did know him. A vague name, a cold feeling seeping through my veins, as if that image had been waiting to be discovered. I didn't know what it was exactly, but something compelled me to put the photo in my pocket and continue with the reorganization. That night, when I sat down in front of my desk to review some documents, I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. That figure. I couldn't get it out of my mind. Something told me I had to investigate further. Something told me that this image was not just a forgotten memory, but a doorway to something much darker. I went back to the photo as soon as I could, looking at it closely. At first, I thought the distortion in the figure was a product of time, a natural imperfection of old photographs. But as I watched, something began to bother me. The quality of the photo didn't seem to match the details. The other limbs in the image were sharp, well-defined, albeit old, but that figure was clearly out of place. Not just in the image, but in the place itself. I decided to investigate the mansion. The photograph had been taken in front of what looked like an old stone building, with a garden and trees lining the property. I remembered that there were several historic houses in the area, some abandoned and others converted into small museums. I headed to the local library the next day, hoping to find some clue that would allow me to identify the mansion in the photo. Throughout the morning, I searched through old archives, records, and maps. Finally, a name caught my attention: the Varela Mansion. It had been built in the early 19th century by a wealthy family from the region. According to the documents, the Varela family had been known for their social activities, but also for certain dark rumors that had always surrounded their name. There was something disturbing about the Varelas, something that no one seemed to want to remember. The mansion had been abandoned several decades ago, and according to some reports, the property had been sold to a developer who, after several financial difficulties, never managed to put it to use. Something about the history of that mansion resonated with the feeling that had come over me when I looked at the photograph. I decided to go to the site. When I arrived at the Varela Mansion, I could not help but feel a sense of uneasiness. The property was in a state of total abandonment, with ivy-covered walls and broken windows. The structure of the house still looked solid, but the doors and windows were sealed shut. As I walked through the garden, I noticed the same type of trees that appeared in the photograph. Memories of the image mingled with the reality of what I saw, as if somehow I had reached a point of no return. I began to explore the surroundings, looking for some clue, some indication that could link the mansion to the people in the photograph. Among the undergrowth, I found a small construction, something similar to a service house or a shed. I decided to go inside. There was not much to see. Dust covered every corner, and the darkness was almost palpable. However, something caught my eye on the floor. It was a small wooden box covered in dust and cobwebs. I opened it carefully. Inside the box, I found several objects, among them another set of photographs. Some showed the Varela family itself. Others showed people I didn't recognize. But what made my blood run cold was the last photo, the one at the bottom. It was the same image I had found in my apartment. The same scene, the same group of people posing in front of the mansion. But this time, The figure in the background was much clearer. The man, with his distorted face, was there, and now I could see him clearly. On the back of the photo, there was a handwritten inscription, which I could not immediately read due to the aging of the paper. With some effort, I managed to make it legible. It read, "The man who must not be named." The chill that ran down my spine was immediate. That sentence, written with such urgency and dread, confirmed something I had begun to suspect. There was something much darker behind that mansion, behind that family. And worse, that man, that distorted figure, was linked to my past in some way that I could not fully understand. I could not clear the doubt that settled in my mind. Who was that man? What had the Varela family done? And how was I related to all this? That night, when I returned to my apartment, I felt watched. The clocks I had left on the tables all seemed to be striking the same time. My breathing was deeper, as if the air was heavier. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, and the photograph I had found in the storage room was now on my desk, wide open, as if someone had placed it there in my absence. The man in the photo was closer than I thought, and I was about to discover what secrets that picture held, and how my life had been intertwined with that dark past that so terrified me. I had always thought that secrets were time's way of protecting us from what we are not prepared to face. But everything changed the day I found the diary. The afternoon was cold, the city covered by a thick fog that almost made it impossible to see a few meters away. People walked fast, without looking at each other, without talking. I did the same, like another automaton, following the usual routine. Sometimes life has the capacity to become a series of repetitive actions, where monotony becomes the most comfortable refuge. The job, the house, the same people. Nothing seemed to change. Until one day, everything stopped. It was a gray Thursday, one of those days when everything seems to presage that something is going to happen. The library, a place I used to frequent regularly, was almost empty. The air was heavy with the fragrance of old books, a mixture of dust, leather, and time. I found myself walking among the shelves of the most remote section, the one that no one used to explore. In that part of the place, the books had no clear organization. Some were piled up in a disorderly fashion, others seemed out of place. But it was in that corner, in the shadows, that I found it. The book was not exactly a book. It was a diary, a small one, with a leather cover worn by the passage of time. It was covered with dust, which indicated that it had been there for a long time. I didn't look for it. I wasn't expecting it, but something in its presence attracted me. I picked it up carefully, and when I opened it, I discovered it was empty. There were no words, only blank pages. However, at the bottom, on the last page, something was handwritten. It was a short text, but enough to catch my attention. At the time, I didn't understand why I found that little notation so disturbing. Maybe it was the handwriting, or maybe it was the fact that there was nothing else in the journal except that little sentence at the end. What it said, cryptically and simply, was, "Not everything you see is real. There are things that must remain in the dark." That simple warning made me uncomfortable, not because it was frightening, but because it struck a chord, something inside me that urged me to read on. Without knowing why, I decided to take it with me. No one in the library seemed to pay any attention to what I was doing, and although the feeling of having found something important did not leave me, I had no idea what was in store for me. Night fell quickly, as it always does in winter. In my apartment, a desk lamp cast a warm light on the wooden floor, while the sound of the wind rattled the windows. The newspaper lay on the table, open on the last page, as if waiting for something from me. The phrase was still etched in my mind, and although there was something in me that warned me not to continue, I couldn't help it. I began to write. At first, the words seemed to flow easily. I described the day, the moment I found the journal, my scattered thoughts. But as I moved forward, Something strange began to happen. The words became more intense, more urgent, as if something or someone was dictating to me what to write. I could not stop. My hand moved on its own. The sentences followed one after the other without my being able to reflect on them. Ever since I arrived in the city, the shadows have followed me. There is something strange in its streets, something I cannot understand. People don't see it, but I do. It's as if they're hiding from something, as if we were all running away from a past we wouldn't dare face. But I saw it. Yesterday in the park, I saw someone. He was there, watching me from the darkness. I know what I'm saying sounds irrational, but I'm sure I wasn't alone. Something is here, waiting. The words seemed to be etched in my mind, and I couldn't stop writing. Each sentence was more disturbing than the last, as if someone was forcing me to tell a story I had forgotten myself, a story I didn't want to remember. At some point, I began to doubt my own sanity. Was I writing, or was something or someone writing through me? The night progressed slowly, and when I awoke the next day, the lamp was still on. The journal was closed on the table, and the pages were completely different. It was no longer blank. Now they were full of words, jumbled sentences like a story that had been written all at once. But it wasn't my handwriting. I woke up with the feeling that something was watching me, as if I was not alone. My body was tense, my throat dry, my heart racing. I sat up, looked at the clock on the table, and realized that I had lost all sense of time. The night was gone, and it was already late. But what disturbed me most was the feeling that I had done something without being fully aware of it. The journal had changed, and I didn't remember touching it after I started writing. That afternoon, I decided to investigate the object further, but the search led me nowhere clear. There was no reference to the journal or its author in the library archives. The only clue was the small inscription on the first page, "The Shadows." But I didn't understand what it meant. The uncomfortable feeling was consuming me. The more I thought about it, the more the weight on my chest intensified. I didn't want to go on, but at the same time, I couldn't stop. I had to know. That night, after several days of avoiding it, I opened the journal again. It was no longer a blank book. The pages were filled with detailed, obscure text. Each word was a revelation that I couldn't quite understand, but seemed to be addressed directly to me. It described events in my life that I didn't remember, moments that had been buried in some corner of my memory. I never wanted you to remember what happened, but time always takes care of its work. The fact that you found this diary is no accident. You knew that sooner or later you would have to face it. You have to know what you did. As I read those words, I felt a knot in my stomach. I couldn't understand. What had I done? What was the diary talking about? Why did I feel like the words were accusing me? What kind of connection did I have with all this? Darkness took over the room. The air was thick, cold, as if something had changed. Something was lurking, but I couldn't tell what it was. I just knew I couldn't get out of this cycle. The words in the journal were beginning to repeat themselves, and they were becoming clearer and clearer. They were no longer just fragments. There were whole accounts of my life, of my past, of people I had completely forgotten. You remember the building, don't you? The place where it all began. That day, when you decided to go in, you knew what you would find. You knew you couldn't come out the same. Fear gripped me. I began to remember. An old building, a dilapidated building on the outskirts of town. It had been there that my life had taken a turn. Something happened in that place. Something dark. I remembered the shadows, the indistinct figures, and above all, the feeling of having crossed a line I should never have crossed. The diary was not showing me the whole truth. It was only leading me into a deeper abyss, into something I was not supposed to know. I knew I couldn't stop. I was trapped in the cycle of this story that I didn't understand, but that was already part of me. And with every page I turned, I was getting closer to a secret that had remained buried for years. The shadows I had left behind were no longer outside of me. They were inside. And the diary was the key to a truth I could not ignore. I finally understood what the diary said. Not everything you see is real. Some things, like shadows, are destined to remain in the dark, forever. The snow had been falling incessantly for hours, a white curtain that turned the streets into an inert landscape. Everything seemed to stand still. It was a cruel winter, not only because of the cold, but also because of the feeling of desolation that accompanied it. The lights of the city flickered with the timid hope of penetrating the darkness, but nothing seemed capable of breaking the stillness that enveloped everything. I, walking in the shadows, could not help but think that things would never be the same again. The case seemed simple at first. One murder, one victim, one suspect. The pieces fit, the evidence was clear, and the conclusion seemed inevitable. It was Hugo, my lifelong friend, who had committed the crime. The kind of man who, until that moment, I would never have considered capable of such a thing. But the truth is not always what it seems, and in this case, time, like snow, had begun to undo what I believed to be true. My name is Diego. I am a criminologist. People usually think that the study of crime is just a matter of logic, of hard facts. But no one knows what lies behind a case like this, when everything seems to fall apart inside. My life had been orderly until this case crossed my path. And if you honestly ask me, I have always had a penchant for darkness, as if I felt more comfortable in it than under the blinding light of truth. That was the reason I didn't let Hugo's case slip away from me, despite everything. Things started to go wrong when the police called me that morning. A body had been found in an alley behind an office building, the body of a woman with clear signs of violence. It was not an impulsive murder, that was obvious. It was all precisely planned. It had been cold, methodical, and the autopsy confirmed the worst. The victim had been trapped for hours, suffering, before she was finally killed. No one in the neighborhood had heard anything. No witnesses, no clear evidence, just an almost too clean crime scene. The first thing the officers did was arrest Hugo. The police had found his phone near the crime scene, and the fact that, in his house, they had discovered traces of blood on the soles of his shoes was the last straw. Hugo was not a violent man, at least he had never been in my eyes, but all signs pointed to him. And in a case like this, when the culprit seems so clear, the trial becomes a mere formality. However, there was something inside me that wouldn't let me accept the conclusion. Something didn't fit. For the first few days I watched Hugo, as did the police, but there was nothing about him that struck me as murderous. When I met his gaze, I felt a strange mixture of despair and fear, but also confusion. As if he wasn't there at all. As if I didn't understand what had happened. At first, I didn't pay too much attention to him. The case seemed so clear. A man who had had problems with the woman, a broken relationship, a cell phone found at the crime scene. What else could there be? The police reports left no room for doubt. However, something in me began to worry me. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen in Hugo's eyes. It was as if he wasn't involved, as if he was just a pawn caught up in a much bigger game. I started digging deeper. The detectives said there was nothing to be done, that Hugo was the culprit, but the criminologist in me was urging me to dig deeper, to look for the cracks in the story that no one seemed to notice. There was one piece of the puzzle that didn't fit: motive. Hugo had been a friend of mine for years. I knew him well. I knew that, although his romantic relationships were not the best, he had never shown the slightest hint of violence. He was a man who preferred to stay in the shadows, quiet and solitary, but never dangerous. He had no reason to kill that woman, either in his personal or professional life. And as the days went by, the certainty in my mind that something was not right grew more and more. One day, as I was going through the phone records and interviews conducted with Hugo, something caught my attention. A number, It was the phone number of a woman named Valeria, a friend of the victim, someone who had not been mentioned before in the reports. At first, the police had considered Valeria irrelevant, but when I examined further, I discovered that she had had frequent contact with the victim in the weeks leading up to his death. Something didn't add up. The woman had been seen with the victim on the day of his murder, but had disappeared immediately afterwards. No one knew anything about her. It was clear that something was not being said. I decided to look for more information about Valeria. I drove to her last known address and came across a house that looked abandoned. The doorbell was broken, the windows were covered by dark-colored curtains, and the garden, though small, was neglected. At first, there was no sign of life, but as I approached the back door, everything changed. The door opened slowly, as if someone was waiting for me. Inside, all was quiet, but I could feel the presence of something hidden in the shadows. When I entered, the air was thick, almost suffocating. There was something strange in the atmosphere. There was no furniture or decorations, just bare walls and the echo of my own footsteps. As I walked through the house, I noticed something peculiar. The walls were covered with photos. They were all pictures of the same woman, the victim. And what was even more disturbing, each of the photos had been marked with something in particular, small red circles around her face. Finally, I found what I was looking for. On the floor, there was a folder with documents. When I opened it, I discovered a bunch of photos of Hugo, some of which showed moments in his life that I didn't remember. There was one photo in particular that chilled me. It was of a meeting between Hugo, Valeria, and the victim. The photo showed not just a simple conversation between them, but something more. The three of them looked uneasy, almost tense. But what caught my attention the most was the background. In the reflection of a nearby window, you could clearly see a man who did not belong to the group. He was standing in the background, staring silently. My hands began to tremble as I stared at the image. The truth was beginning to become clear, and what I saw terrified me. Hugo had not been the culprit. He had been manipulated. The woman, Valeria, had been using Hugo as a pawn, but not just to get back at her friend. She was playing a much bigger game. She had been in contact with someone else, someone who was behind all this, and that person, that figure, hidden in the shadow of the photograph, was the real culprit. It all fit together now. Hugo had been chosen as a scapegoat, someone who couldn't defend himself, someone who wasn't able to see what was going on around him. But I was, and even though the cold that ran through my body wasn't just from the winter, I couldn't stand idly by. I had come too far to stop now. It was time to unmask the real culprit. With the information I had uncovered, I headed to the place where Valeria had been hiding. The weather had become even more inclement, as if winter itself was conspiring against me. But nothing could stop me. The wind beat against my face as I walked toward the house. And there, in the half-light of the entrance, I found what I had been looking for. The figure that had been manipulating everything from the shadows. It was the man in the photograph, the man who had never been mentioned. I don't know at what exact moment I made the mistake, but I knew it as soon as it happened. The experiment I had planned for months, the theory I had built up over years of research, fell apart in a matter of seconds. Everything I had accomplished, everything I had been, seemed to have evaporated in a fraction of the time. Now, all that remained was the echo of the catastrophe, the emptiness of a future that never came to be. My name is Raul Carmona, and I am a scientist. In my field, chemistry is a passion, an obsession. The study of reactions, the transformation of molecules, the ordered chaos of matter, that is what moves me. I am not looking for fame or recognition, although I know that achievements in science always bring those things with them. My only quest is for truth, that pure truth that only science can reveal. Or at least I thought so until that fateful night. The laboratory where I worked was not a particularly large or prestigious place. It was a dark space, surrounded by shelves full of glass flasks, test tubes, flasks, and all the scientific paraphernalia one might expect. The air was permeated with a smell of chemicals and something else, something almost unmistakable, a smell of failure perhaps, that was always present, lurking in every corner, even though he didn't want to admit it. The experiment I was planning was something I had dreamed of since I began my career, the creation of a highly energetic compound that could revolutionize energy. For years I had been working on it, experimenting with various combinations of elements and compounds, tinkering, taking notes, abandoning some ideas and revising others. But finally he had reached the point where he believed he had succeeded. I thought I had everything under control. The theory behind my experiment was based on a series of complex chemical reactions, transforming common elements into substances of extremely high energy. My hypothesis was that, by combining certain catalysts with the right compounds, I could release infinitely greater amounts of energy than any other source known at the time. It was not a trivial invention, and the risks, of course, were great. But as any good scientist knows, risks are the basis of any breakthrough. I prepared meticulously for the day. I reviewed every step, every measure, every possible reaction. I applied the strictest safety protocols, protective equipment, isolators, sensors, everything necessary to avoid any kind of accident. But even so, when the time came to carry out the experiment, something inside me couldn't help but feel uneasy. My stomach lurched, as if my body knew something wasn't right, that maybe there was something I was missing. The night was cold. The wind was blowing hard outside the building, and the lights in the lab were flickering intermittently. It was a perfect environment for a discovery. I was alone in the lab, as always in my most important experiments. No one knew what was about to happen, not even me. But to be honest, I felt confident. My confidence was as great as my knowledge. In my mind, everything was settled. I started with the mixing of the first compounds. The initial reaction was smooth, like most of the reactions I had done in previous trials. Nothing out of the ordinary. The process continued calmly, each step happening just as I had anticipated. The mixture began to release a small amount of gas, something I had observed in previous tests, but not enough to worry me. The temperature gauges were holding steady. The pressure inside the containers was just right. Everything seemed to indicate that the experiment would proceed as planned. But then, without warning, something changed. A slight buzzing in the air, an imperceptible vibration on the floor, alerted me. I looked at the control monitors, but there was no sign that anything was out of place. That's when I felt the pressure. Something was happening beyond what I could see, beyond numbers, beyond theory. The gas began to release faster, faster than I had calculated. The temperature rose in a matter of seconds, and the compounds I had prepared began to react unexpectedly. The equilibrium was broken. A bluish glow began to emanate from the center of the experiment, and the walls of the lab began to shake slightly. Even with the chaos raging around me, I tried to remain calm. I made an adjustment to the pressure regulator, but to no avail. The compounds were still reacting, faster, more intensely, as if they had taken on a life of their own. At that point, I realized that I could no longer control what was happening. The blue glow began to intensify, and the noise, once just a hum, had now become a deafening roar. Alarms began to sound. The security systems were automatically activated, but it was obvious that they were not designed to handle something like this. That's when disaster struck. An explosion, a brutal jolt that threw me against the wall of the lab. The glass of the flasks exploded into 1,000 pieces, and a wave of heat hit me. The atmosphere was filled with a dense, toxic smoke that made me cough violently. I tried to stand up, but my legs did not respond. The air was laden with chemicals, and the world around me began to spin. My vision blurred, and in a desperate attempt I tried to turn off the alarms to control the disaster. But it was useless. The damage had already been done. I remember standing there in the midst of the chaos, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. Something in me wanted to accept that I had failed, that I had made a mistake, but my pride, that same strength that had driven me to go so far, would not let me. I could not admit that all I had done, all my life of work and sacrifice, had been in vain. The police arrived soon after, along with firefighters and emergency crews. Luckily, the damage had not spread beyond the lab, but the emotional damage was far greater. The university where I worked shut down the lab immediately, and all my experiments were suspended. Although the material damage was not of great magnitude, what had really been destroyed was my reputation. Initial reports indicated that it was a failure of the containment system, but I knew the truth. The experiment had failed because the theory was flawed, because I had assumed that the compounds would react the way I wanted them to. I had been arrogant. I had underestimated the unpredictable nature of chemical reactions. The days that followed were a whirlwind of research, reports, and uncomfortable conversations. Journalists besieged me, asking why the disaster had occurred, whether anyone else was involved. But there were no culprits other than me. No one understood what had happened, and honestly, I didn't fully understand it myself at the time. I only knew that my experiment had failed, and that something much darker had been behind it all. Something I couldn't even begin to explain. My career collapsed before my eyes. The doors that had previously opened to me slammed shut. That night in the lab had not only marked the end of an experiment, but the end of a stage of my life. Memories of that explosion continued to haunt me, as if the atmosphere of the laboratory had been impregnated in my mind. Years later, when the snow begins to fall again, and the cold settles back into the streets, I find myself staring into the void, remembering that moment with a bitter feeling. It wasn't just the experiment that failed. It was something deeper, something inside me, something I can never get back. The consequences of my mistake were irreparable, and though I tried, I never returned to science in the same way. Now, in the middle of winter, as the shadows lengthen, I think that there are things that must not be touched, secrets that must remain hidden in the darkness of ignorance. Because when you try to play with what you don't understand, you can only expect the worst. And I, like all those who have fallen into the temptation of forbidden knowledge, became the real culprit of my own destruction. I remember it with disconcerting clarity, the exact moment when my world vanished and the other absorbed it completely. It was a Friday afternoon, and I, like so many other times, was in front of my desk, adjusting my virtual reality viewer. I had in my hands the new game, a title I had been waiting for months. The Labyrinth of Hades. The name was intriguing, and the hype promised a completely immersive experience. As a seasoned gamer, I had tried everything from vast worlds to interactive stories, but something about the way the developers had sold this game told me that this time it would be different. The promise of an unprecedented level of immersion was something I couldn't pass up. The first level started out like any other. In the game, I found myself in a desert landscape with oppressive skies and distant mountains. The interface had been designed to simulate the sensation of heat and weight, and as soon as I took the first step, the vibration of the virtual shoes made me feel like I was actually walking in the sand. I took a moment to adjust the controls. Virtual reality had come a long way in recent years, and the level of realism was now incredible. Even the wind felt on my face. As always, I took a moment to enjoy the sensation, as the technology was still capable of surprising me. As I progressed through the game, I moved further and further into the realm of the unusual. The scenery seemed to change constantly. One moment I was running through what looked like an ancient ruined city. Then I was running through a dark forest with trees so tall they blocked out the sunlight. Each new environment seemed more real than the last, but it wasn't just the graphical quality that captivated me. There was something about the way everything felt that kept me completely immersed. The roar of the wind, the crunch of the branches under my feet, the slight rumble of the ground under my weight. It was as if none of it was machine-generated, as if I was actually inside the game. But I wasn't. Not quite. At first, it all seemed relatively straightforward. The object of the game was to find a series of lost artifacts that, when collected, allowed you to advance to the next level. I had always been a savvy gamer, and I quickly realized that the virtual world was as dynamic as it was dangerous. There were creatures, traps, and riddles that solved progress. But it wasn't until the third level that things started to get strange. At that level, the virtual world crumbled into a thick fog. Suddenly, I could no longer see the horizon, only an infinite fog that completely surrounded me. I tried to move forward, but the ground became unstable, as if the ground itself was about to sink. My avatar stumbled, and for an instant I felt a stabbing pain in my leg. I looked around, but there was nothing to justify the pain. In a game, physical sensations were simulated, and reactions should have been limited to simple vibrations. However, there was the real pain, something that could not be generated by any feedback system. I remember trying to take off my visor at the time, desperate to get out of that environment. My hand rose toward the edges of the equipment, but something stopped me. The visor was trapped. I couldn't remove it. I couldn't move. My heart started pounding, and anxiety took over. I looked around again, only to find a figure emerging from the fog, blurred, like a misshapen shadow. It was not an enemy in the traditional sense. It wasn't a monster, but it was one all the same. It advanced slowly, as if in no hurry, as if it were waiting for something. A click echoed in my ear, as if something had been activated, and in that instant the fog dissipated. But what I saw froze me. The landscape had changed. I was no longer in the game, at least not in the way I knew it. I was now in an empty space, surrounded only by a vast abyss. My heart began to race again. The air felt thicker, almost sticky, and for a moment I didn't know if I was dreaming, if my mind had pushed the limits of what was possible, or if it was all real. Without warning, the figure I had seen earlier emerged once again. This time, however, it was not far away, not just a shadow in the distance. It was in front of me, right there, watching me. Space seemed to compress. I felt claustrophobic, and although I knew I was in a virtual world, the feeling that everything I saw was real did not leave me. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and my breaths became short. I looked at the viewer interface. There were no options to exit. The emergency buttons were not responding. Something wasn't right. Something in that game, or whatever was going on, had blocked my ability to interact with the outside world. I tried to think, to analyze the situation logically. This can't be real. It's a system error. But the anxiety continued to grow. What if it wasn't? What if there was something in this game that was more than it seemed? Time began to blur, as if the laws that governed my existence were changing. I couldn't count how long it had been since I entered the game. At first I thought it was just an illusion, a temporary glitch. But as the minutes turned into hours, despair set in. There was no way to escape. My hands began to shake. Every time I tried to think of a solution, the fog returned. Space became more compressed, and the figure in front of me began to draw closer. Its shape, once indistinct, became more defined. First it was fuzzy shadows, then details. Soon I could make out a face, though it was the face of something that was not human. The feeling of being trapped intensified. I could neither move nor act. I was completely immobilized in that virtual universe, as if the game itself had assimilated me. The figure was no longer a distant presence. Now, it was so close to me that I could have touched its face if I had the ability to move. I felt a pressure in my chest, as if the air was too thick for me to breathe. And then, the figure spoke. Although it didn't use words, I couldn't help but understand the message. You are trapped. That was the one idea that echoed in my mind, like a mantra. Fear gripped me completely. But there was something else in that revelation. An acceptance that I might never be able to get out of there. I had no proof that something as extreme as being trapped in a game was even possible, but at that point I no longer cared. The only certainty I had was that I couldn't move, that I couldn't get out, that the game wouldn't free me. I tried everything. I knocked on the walls of the viewfinder, I tried to disconnect the cables, but there was no response. The figure watched silently, unhurriedly. Each time it tried to escape, it moved closer, and although it seemed to have no intention of physically attacking me, I knew that my mind was already being taken, pulled into a place where time no longer mattered. It was only a matter of time before I completely fell apart. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, something changed. The fog returned, and with it, the landscape of the virtual world disintegrated once again. When the fog disappeared, I found myself back on the first level. The scene was exactly the same as the one I had seen when I started playing, but something had changed. Everything seemed darker. The sunlight was no longer as warm. The colors were duller. The shadows were deeper. And scariest of all, the figure I was running from was there, watching me from the edge of the horizon. But this time, there was no fog. I knew that if I turned around, it would be the last thing I would see. I was trapped. In that world, in that game, in my mind. And even though my body was intact in the real world, something told me that there was nothing left of me. I was just a player trapped in a virtual reality that I could never leave. My name is Andre Serrano, and although it was not by choice, I carry a surname that carries with it a weight as old as time itself. It is a surname that, over the years, has become an unbearable burden, a mark that cannot be erased. The Serrano family has never been an ordinary family. The shadow of an ancestral curse has accompanied our steps. A curse that has lasted for generations and that sooner or later always catches up with us. The story began centuries ago, according to the accounts of my grandparents, although I could never know if what they said was a warning or a simple superstition. My great-great-grandfather, Don Joaquin Serrano, had been an ambitious man with an iron will and an insatiable desire for power. In those days, the Serrano family was neither rich nor influential, but he had achieved something that few others had. He had found a way to access a power that was beyond the limits of the natural. That power, however, was not meant to be possessed by someone like him, and Joaquin's greed ended up bringing about an irreversible tragedy. No one knows for sure what happened that night. Some say that in his desperation to obtain more, Don Joaquin resorted to ancient forbidden rituals he had discovered in dusty manuscripts in the family library. Others claim that it was his own arrogance that led him to make a pact with unknown forces, forces that now haunt us. The result was always the same. The Serrano family was cursed. For generations, Joaquin's descendants have lived with the weight of that curse, a condemnation that manifests itself in diverse but always lethal forms. At first, fate seemed to play with us, with strange situations that affected our ancestors. Unexplained deaths, disappearances, family betrayals, and a series of events so puzzling that many of us began to wonder if the curse was real, or if it was the result of a paranoid mind that saw what did not exist. Mine was a fairly traditional family. My father, mother, and I lived in a house that was far from the hustle and bustle of the city, surrounded by the thicket of a seemingly endless forest. The house had been built by my grandfather, a man who had dedicated his life to preserving the Serrano legacy, and so the family's history had always been present in my life, even when I tried to distance myself from it. At first, everything seemed normal. We were not a family of ostentatious wealth, but we lived comfortably. My father, Don Ernesto Serrano, was a quiet and rigid man whose main interest had always been to keep the family memory alive. My mother, Sylvia, was a tender and understanding woman, but there was always a shadow of sadness in her eyes, as if something in her knew what was haunting us, although she never said so. It was one particularly warm summer when things began to change. I was 32 years old at the time, and my life seemed to be at a kind of standstill. I was working in an accounting office, a routine that stifled me, and I couldn't find a way to escape the claustrophobic feeling that enveloped me day after day. The same feeling that, it seemed, had dragged my whole family down. That afternoon, my mother called to inform me that my father had fallen seriously ill. It was no ordinary illness, not something that could be attributed to a simple flu. He was in a state of constant delirium, with a high fever and extreme weakness. It was then that I decided to return to the family home, after years of avoiding it, in the hope of finding answers. Upon arrival, the atmosphere was even more somber than I remembered. The house, which in my childhood had seemed so cozy, now felt like a cage. Every corner seemed to be permeated with a heavy energy, an echo of the past seeping through the cracks. What disturbed me most was not my father's condition, nor the eerie silence that reigned in the house, but the sense that something was lurking, something invisible, but palpably present. In desperation, I went through the family archives. My parents never openly told me about the curse, but something inside me told me it was time to face the truth. Deep down, I knew that my family was trapped in a cycle from which I could not escape. And something in my grandfather's old letters made me suspect that my father had been searching for a solution to that curse for years, though he had never mentioned it. The yellowed pages I found contained references to an ancient book, a grimoire that, according to legends, held the knowledge necessary to break the cycle. The search for this book led me to a small room in the attic, a place that was rarely accessed. As I opened the door, a cold, stale air hit me in the face, as if time had been trapped there, waiting to be released. There, on an old table, was the book. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if no one had touched it in centuries. As I turned the pages, I could read fragments that spoke of sacrifices and pacts, of the existence of forces beyond our comprehension, and of how the Serrano family had been chosen to bear an inherited curse. The solution seemed as simple as it was terrifying. To break the cycle, a family member had to be sacrificed, one who was willing to face the darkness that had taken root in their veins. The air in the room became thick, as if the book itself was absorbing the light from the lamp. And then, the truth hit me with terrifying clarity. My father, in his desperation to save the family, had been looking for a way to undo what he himself had helped to create. But he had not succeeded. The curse was still alive. Now, it was up to me to face what had been decided for the Serrano family since its founding. That night, the house seemed to be alive. I listened to the noises, the creaking doors, the whispers in the darkness. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. I was alone in the living room when my father's fever began to worsen. The delirium on his face seemed to take on a more disturbing form, and although he was there, he seemed to be somewhere else at the same time, in a separate dimension, as if he was no longer among us. I remember that everything blurred at that moment. My mind began to hallucinate, or so I thought. The walls of the house twisted, and the figure of my father, prostrate on his bed, watched me with an empty stare. His breathing was a ragged whisper. I knew I was too late to save him, and that my only way out was to comply with what the book suggested. Desperation drove me to the ruins of the back garden, where my grandfather had buried an old chest somewhere in the past. Not knowing exactly what I expected to find, I dug frantically. When I finally unearthed it, the chest was heavy and seemed to pulsate, as if a dark energy emanated from within. Inside, I found a dark, gleaming stone, which, when I touched it, enveloped me in a cold, immense sensation. At the same time, I heard a distant laugh, a familiar laugh that chilled my blood. Something had been activated, and I couldn't stop it. The price I had to pay for breaking the cycle of the curse was clear. Someone's life would have to be given up, and it would not be my father's sacrifice. No, the curse could not be undone without one of the descendants taking the place of their ancestor. The next day, my mother was dead, and I could not remember how it had happened. The curse had been fulfilled, but my soul had been lost in the process. The house is still the same, even though I am no longer there. The curse is never broken, It is only passed from generation to generation, an endless cycle that slowly devours those who carry it with them. I don't know if it will ever be broken, but I do know that the Serrano family will never be free, no matter how hard they try. The darkness will always be waiting, lurking, because the real evil is not in the sacrifice, but in the price paid for trying to escape the inevitable. And I am the last link in a broken chain, doomed to repeat itself. I never imagined that fear could take hold of me in such a visceral way. I thought I knew the nature of fear. I had studied it from afar. I had analyzed it. I had even experienced it in its mildest version. But I never really understood it. Fear comes in many forms, but my worst enemy has always been claustrophobia. I spent years dealing with it. I knew it was there, lurking in the shadows of my mind, waiting for the perfect moment to make its appearance. But I always believed I was strong enough to control it, to handle it, to not let it dominate my life. After all, I am a man of reason, of logic, of method. But that all changed one cold November morning when I was caught in a situation that pushed my limits, my understanding of fear, and my ability to remain calm. I was working as a civil engineer in a construction company. My work focused on planning subway infrastructure, tunnels, passageways, sewers, everything related to the world that lies beneath the surface of our cities. For many, this might be a routine task, an ordinary job, but for me, each project faced a small internal battle. Each time I descended into those dark, enclosed spaces, my breathing became heavier, my pulse quickened, and my thoughts clouded with anguish. It wasn't that I was afraid of the tunnels themselves. What terrified me was the thought of being trapped, with no way out, surrounded by walls that were slowly crushing me. But of course, I kept going. What choice did I have? The work paid well, and the opportunities were becoming more and more frequent. At first, I tried to avoid projects that involved work in close quarters, but at some point, a major opportunity arose. A new contract for a network of tunnels that would connect the most remote districts of the city. It was a gigantic project, and my company needed my expertise. So I didn't hesitate, accepted the challenge, and plunged headlong into the project without considering the consequences. I remember the day it all began. It was a gray day, with the sky covered by heavy clouds that promised rain. The air was cold, almost biting, as if the city itself was tightening its embrace on us. That day I found myself again inside one of the newly excavated tunnels. It was a huge structure, an entrance that would lead us into a labyrinth of passageways. And although I never felt completely comfortable in such places, I trusted the team with me. They were professionals, and the tunnel was built to withstand any kind of pressure. What I didn't know at the time was that the real danger wouldn't come from the concrete walls or the machines. My shift began in the morning, and the excavation was progressing at a good pace. The process was meticulous, as always, and as I walked through the tunnel, checking every detail of the walls and structure, I felt a slight discomfort. It was a strange feeling, as if something wasn't right, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. The sound of the machines echoed in my ears, the vibration of the ground beneath my boots, and the echo of the tireless work gave me a false sense of security. However, something inside me, something deep inside me, told me that all that was about to change. Suddenly, the tunnel shook. It was a small quake, almost imperceptible, but enough to stop everyone for an instant. I looked around, quickly assessing the situation. The lights flickered, and the equipment stopped working in a collective sigh. I looked toward the exit, where the lights were shining like little beacons in the darkness. Everything seemed to be under control, but the discomfort grew. I decided to walk deeper into the tunnel for further inspection. As I moved further away from the entrance, the atmosphere became denser, the cold, dry air clinging to my skin. Each step echoed in the void, and each breath was heavier than the last. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but my mind began to obsess over insignificant details: a crack in a wall, a small hole in the ceiling, a vibration that didn't seem entirely natural. Suddenly, the shaking returned, this time stronger. The floor shook violently, and the sound of the machines abruptly shut down, as if the electrical system had failed simultaneously. At that moment, panic settled in my chest. I felt a tightness in my throat and a knot in my stomach. I was not prepared for this. I thought I could handle it, that my years of experience would allow me to remain calm. But something inside me snapped. A deep terror gripped my body, and my mind began to wander into the dark corners of my phobia. I gritted my teeth and tried to stand my ground, but anguish swept over me. I remembered, as if in a nightmare, the narrow passage I had had to pass through years ago on another project, how the air had become unbreathable, how the feeling of being trapped had invaded me. Now, that same feeling was multiplied. The tunnel felt like a mouth slowly devouring me. The walls seemed to close in, crushing me. My breathing quickened, and my vision blurred. I felt the need to get out, to escape, but I could not. The only way was forward, into the depths of the earth. My body began to move automatically, as if I no longer had control. Every step I took seemed harder, heavier, and the air became thicker. The tunnel seemed endless, and the further I went, the harder it was to breathe. I felt the walls as if they were closing in around me. It was a claustrophobic, oppressive feeling, slowly suffocating me. The sound of my footsteps echoed like a sentence, as if each echo reminded me how far I was from the exit. The lights, once a reliable guide, now seemed to flicker, as if the darkness wanted to devour everything in its path. Anxiety completely paralyzed me. I could not move. I could not breathe. My heart pounded in my throat, and my hands shook uncontrollably. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself, to find an anchor point, something to help me get out of this spiral of terror. But there was nothing. There was only me, trapped in an endless tunnel, in a concrete box that surrounded me from every angle. My mind was filled with distorted images, memories of past moments, of other times when I felt fear, but none of that prepared me for what I was experiencing. Time seemed to melt away, and I didn't know if minutes, hours, or days had passed. All I knew was that if I didn't get out of there soon, I wouldn't make it. The anguish was eating me up inside, and my body was about to succumb to that invisible pressure. At some point, the lights came back on, and the shaking stopped. The tunnel, though still dark and oppressive, no longer seemed like an endless maze. My mind began to clear, and with effort, I managed to move. My legs trembled, and every step was a challenge, but I moved forward, looking for the exit, looking for the respite my body so desperately needed. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I saw the light at the end of the tunnel, literally. The entrance was close, and I could hear the voices of the team that had been left behind. I felt the biggest relief of my life as I crossed that last line, as I stepped out of the darkness that almost consumed me. But the fear did not go away. I knew that, although I had physically escaped, my mind had been scarred. Phobia doesn't go away so easily. It was there, in every corner of my being, waiting for the moment when I could face it again. I don't know how much longer I can bear that weight, that shadow that follows me, that fear that never completely goes away. All I know is that fear is not something you can control with logic or reason. Sometimes you can only face it and hope it doesn't consume you completely. But in my case, fear has already touched me so deeply that even if I manage to get out of this tunnel, I know there will always be another one waiting for me. Whenever I wake up, the feeling is the same. A weight on my chest, a constant pressure that accompanies me for a few minutes, until my mind clears and I understand that I am at home. My home. But that doesn't mean I'm safe. The place where I live is nothing more than a temporary refuge, a space where I seek solace while I recover from what haunts me. Because what haunts me is not something physical, but something much worse. A nightmare that never ends, that always comes back stronger. Every night is the same. I go to bed, close my eyes and hope, in vain, that sleep will take me to a quiet place. But what always happens is that I fall back into the same nightmare, as if it were an endless cycle, as if the same script were being written over and over again on my consciousness. The rain is always there. In the nightmare, the rain never stops. It is constant, monotonous, like the dripping of an old broken pipe that keeps echoing in the corners of my mind. The rain falls mercilessly, soaking the streets, flooding the corridors, dampening every corner of the place where I find myself, but it never seems to be wet. The dampness sticks to my skin like an invisible layer that I cannot remove. In the nightmare, everything is dark, but it's not total darkness. It is a darkness that seems to be filled with eerie shadows, figures moving at the edges of my vision. Sometimes I see them, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I think they are about to appear, but they do not. Sometimes I feel they are already behind me, silently watching me, waiting for me to turn around to catch me. But I don't. I never turn around. I can't. I never remember how I got there. The nightmare always starts at the same point. A house. An old building, the walls covered with mold, the air thick and stale. It is a house that has no windows, or at least if it does, they are covered by black curtains that do not allow light to enter. Sometimes I think it is a house that no longer exists, that never really existed, but there it is, and I'm always inside it. The stairs are the same ones I go down every night. Each step crosses my foot with a frightening softness, as if I'm walking on a surface that crumbles under my weight. I dare to descend without looking back, because I know that if I do, the shadows will grow denser, closer. The air becomes heavier and heavier, the sound of the rain more deafening. My breathing becomes more agitated, and each step I take brings me closer to what I know is waiting. When I reach the second floor, I feel a pang in my stomach. I know that somewhere in that house there is a door that I must not open, a door that, if I dare to open it, will lead me even further into an abyss that has no end. But I can't help it. The nightmare always pushes me towards it, as if it were programmed to lead me to that destination. I don't know what's on the other side of the door, but I know that whatever is there, I want it. I want it. The door is closed. It always is. But that doesn't stop me. My hand trembles when I touch the knob, and even though my fingers are wet with moisture, the door gives way easily. And then, once again, it's in. Inside, the atmosphere is even more suffocating, more closed. The air is thick, and the walls seem to shrink as I move forward, as if the space is purposefully constricting, pressing in on me. I can hear my own heart pounding in my chest, and though I try to breathe deeply, the air never seems to reach my lungs. I feel the darkness consuming me, pulling me into some distant, unknown place. But I keep walking, never looking back, never stopping. That's when I hear the sound, a distant sound at first, as if coming from somewhere beneath my feet. The soft pounding of footsteps, shuffling slowly, as if someone or something was approaching cautiously. Fear immediately sweeps through me, but I try not to succumb to it. I can't let fear control me. I've been here many times before. No matter how many times I repeat the cycle, I have to keep going. My mind screams at me not to look, not to stop, but something inside me can't help it. I turn around. In the doorway, the figure is there, standing still, unmoving. Although I can't see it clearly, I know it's looking at me. There is no face, only a shadow deeper than the darkness itself, a human silhouette that seems to dissolve into thin air. Its presence paralyzes me. I cannot move. I cannot breathe. Fear grips me, and in that instant, I feel like I'm about to fall, about to disappear in that darkness. That's when I hear a whisper so low that I can barely hear it. but so sharp that it makes my skin crawl. My body tenses, and even though I try to pull back, my legs don't respond. I am trapped. The figure takes a step toward me, just one, and the air freezes. Time stands still for a moment. The sound of the rain is drowned out, and all that remains is the unmistakable rustle of its passing. A sound that echoes in my head, as if the whole world is being compressed into that small space. The figure is now so close that I can feel its presence, as if its coldness invades my entire being. In that instant, something inside me screams to survive, to wake up, to get out of the nightmare. But I don't. I can't. The figure is so close that it feels like it could touch me at any moment. And when it finally does, the darkness swallows everything. My mind dissolves, and all that's left is emptiness. I wake up sweaty, heart racing, breathing ragged. The room is cold, raindrops are still hitting the window panes, and everything seems to be in its place. But something is different. I feel like I haven't come out of the nightmare. I feel like I haven't fully awakened. I stand up shakily and look around. Everything is silent, except for the sound of the rain still falling. I decide to walk to the window, but before I get there, I stop. Something is wrong. Something is not right. Someone is at the door, or something. The silhouette in the darkness. I can't see its face, but I know it's there, waiting. The figure is waiting for me. And worst of all, I'm not sure if I'm still dreaming or if this is real. The biting wind whipped my face like ice blades. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones as I moved forward, my boots echoing on the mud-soaked ground. The fog covered the terrain like a thick blanket, making every step uncertain. At that hour of dawn, the world seemed to crumble into silence. Only the distant sound of the storm raging beyond the horizon broke the silence that dominated the landscape. My name doesn't matter. What matters is my mission. I have been working below decks for months, trying to expose what lies behind the closed doors of the sect that for so long has dominated the region. I don't know how they came to have so much power. I will probably never know. I only know that what they are doing is dark, twisted, and certainly dangerous. It's not just a religion, it's a cult, a manipulation machine that feeds on people's desperation and ignorance. I had managed to infiltrate their inner circle through a series of contacts I trusted. The doors that open for an infiltrator are always discreet, almost invisible. No one in the outside world knows who I am. No one knows I'm there. Sometimes I wonder if I will ever be able to get out. And worst of all, if I can do it without taking with me a part of me that I may never get back. My entry into the cult was meticulously planned. First, I joined like any other believer looking for answers. From the outside, their rituals seemed harmless, if bizarre. Their teachings, a set of philosophies mixed with pseudo-scientific principles, captivated the weak, those who found no peace in the world around them. At first, it all seemed like a kind of group therapy, a technique to find the purpose of life. No one warned me what would happen next. Weeks went by and I got caught up in the routine. The daily meditations, the chanting at imposed times, the progress reports in which I had to detail every thought, every feeling, every conversation. As I progressed, so did my role within the cult. And with each step, the truth behind its facade of harmony became clearer. The cult did not seek to heal its members, much less guide them to enlightenment. They sought to control them. They manipulated the most vulnerable minds, those who felt lost, isolated from the world, those who had nothing to lose. At first, I resisted. I thought I could continue to observe and gather information without getting sucked in. But I soon realized that the cult did not allow its members to remain neutral. If you didn't surrender completely, if you didn't commit to them, you were soon a piece out of place. And the misplaced pieces, the ones that showed resistance, disappeared. That's how I found myself drawn into the center of it all. A dark, cold space where the rules were no longer limited to chanting or meditations. It was the ritual taking place in the main hall that really unsettled me. Every night, as the storm raged outside, the senior members would gather in a windowless room, with no access to outside light, where everything seemed permeated by an opaque sense of anxiety. The air was thick, as if the walls were made of shadows. There was something that overwhelmed me as I entered. It was as if the place itself was designed to make one feel small, insignificant. The whole space breathed control. The members were lined up in a formation, like pieces on a chessboard. The leader, who never had a name, but whom everyone called simply the Master, led the rituals, a ceremony in which everything revolved around submission, the sacrifice of the deepest part of the self, the dissolution of the ego. The first time I participated in that ritual, it was more of a demand than a choice. The Master's eyes seemed to pierce the soul, as if he could read my thoughts before I thought them. His presence was so heavy that I was almost short of breath. I could not breathe normally. Every movement in the room was followed by an expectant silence, a silence that crushed me more than the cold of the storm. Gradually, I understood that the purpose of the cult was not the welfare of its members, but a kind of mind-washing in which each individual had to dissolve completely to be replaced by a new version of himself, one that questioned nothing, one who could not think for himself. They called it purification, but I saw something much darker. It was a process where not only the mind was subdued, but also the body. Tensions, fears, weaknesses were absorbed by the cult as if they were nutrients feeding an invisible beast. I couldn't stop thinking about what I was seeing. There was something viscerally disturbing in the behavior of the new members. They were different when they arrived, but in a matter of weeks, they became empty shadows. They were expressionless. They had no personality. They spoke only when asked, and everything they said was permeated by a blind faith that was frightening. It didn't matter what anyone thought or felt before they entered. When they went through the rituals, something changed. And even though my instincts were screaming at me that I should escape, I knew I could not. Not yet. The ultimate test came one night when the Master summoned me. I had already been undercover for months, gathering information without arousing suspicion. However, what happened in that room was not in my plans. The Master, with his fixed gaze, offered me an opportunity that I did not know how to refuse. He invited me to participate in a secret ritual, one reserved only for those who had proven their loyalty. For me, it was the key to obtaining the information I needed to expose them. I was too close to finding out everything. How could I turn down the opportunity? That night, the rain pounded hard on the roof of the house, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. We were inside the main room, once again, and all seemed quiet. The only light was dim, coming from red candles that illuminated the lined-up figures. The Master said no word, but raised a hand, pointing to an altar in the center of the room. On it, there was an object covered by a cloak. The tension in the room was palpable. What I saw when I uncovered the cloak took my breath away. It was a box, small, dark wood, with symbols engraved on its surface. The Master opened it slowly, and the air became thicker. Inside there was a set of documents, old papers with an ink that seemed to fade with time. However, what caught my attention the most was an envelope. In it, there was a name. Mine. The jolt of adrenaline that coursed through my body was so intense that I found it hard to breathe. How did they know my name? How had they gotten so far? The Master smiled, a gesture so slight that it seemed more like a grimace. Instantly, one of the cult members approached and placed the box in front of me. At that moment, I understood the gravity of my situation. I was trapped. I was no longer just an infiltrator. I was now a piece in a game I didn't fully understand. However, I could not turn back. I could not stop now. I couldn't abandon everything I had learned, everything I had seen. Without thinking, I took the documents and put them in my jacket. I knew I couldn't waste any more time. But, just as I turned to leave, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was one of the older members, a figure who had always watched me in silence. His gaze was cold, empty. He led me to the back of the room, where the master was waiting for me, now standing with a serious, almost defiant expression. He offered me one last look, one last challenge. I knew that, at that moment, I was not getting out alive. If this was all a game, I was not the winner, and I knew it in that instant. The true nature of the cult was not faith or light. It was darkness, and I, trapped in it, would never be the same. When the news of Nicholas's disappearance reached my ears, I knew at the same instant that nothing would ever be the same again. It was not the first time I had faced a case like this. As a detective, I had seen all kinds of disappearances, some explainable, others so dark that they left a bitter taste I couldn't get out of my mouth. But Nicholas, that was different. His case did not follow the pattern of the others. It was an enigma without a solution, an abyss that, as I went deeper into it, seemed to swallow me whole. I remember how the police reported it. A 10-year-old boy, missing without a trace. No witnesses, no clues. The family was devastated, and the small town we lived in, a community so quiet that even the winters seemed to take the turmoil of the world with them, was shrouded in a thick fog of uncertainty. People murmured, wondered, anguished, but no one knew anything. At first, the case officers focused on the obvious. Had he run away? Had he gone to a friend's house? Had he strayed during his walk to the park? But Nicholas had never been a naughty boy. He was introverted, yes, but he wasn't the type to disappear for no reason. And there was something in his mother's look, something in her silence, that told me the answers didn't lie in those simple assumptions. I decided to take the case, not because I was asked to, but because there was something in that void that had opened up in Nicholas's life, in that nothingness that seemed to have swallowed the child whole, that called to me. Perhaps I was doing it because despite everything I had seen in my career, I still had that indelible belief that I could solve any mystery, no matter how obscure. I started with the basics, the family, the neighborhood, friends, the last time someone had seen him. Everything pointed to the same day, to the same afternoon. Nicholas had left his house to go to the corner store, a short walk that had always been part of his daily routine. The store owner, an older man named Franco, said he had seen him come in. Nicholas bought a chocolate bar, as usual, and then left. The store was 2 blocks from his house. It wasn't a long way, but enough to disappear in a heartbeat. The afternoon was gray, cold. Rain had begun to fall intermittently towards the end of the afternoon. An afternoon like any other, in a city like any other. No one saw it after that. No one saw anything. What had happened in those minutes between the store and Nicholas's house? I checked the security cameras of the nearby stores. There I saw something I didn't expect. A figure, faceless, walking on the opposite side of the store from Nicholas's house. In the video, the boy was walking alone, calm, showing no signs of being followed or harassed. But what was disturbing was what happened next. The camera was no longer following him. It stopped suddenly, as if the figure had dissolved into nothingness, as if time had stopped its course. I watched and rewatched the recording, but the same answer hit me again and again. Nothing. The weather took a turn for the worse that night. The storm began to hit hard. The winds howled with such violence that it seemed as if the world outside was falling apart. My office, however, was quiet, at least outwardly. I sat at my desk with my head full of questions, of possible hypotheses. Was someone involved? Had Nicholas been taken? Had it been an accident? The most disconcerting thing was the way everything had happened. From one moment to the next, Nicholas had disappeared without a trace. The next day, I decided to go to Nicholas's parents' house. The mother was absent, in an attempt to follow the psychologist's instructions, trying to keep busy, but the father, a quiet, tired-looking man, received me without objection. The first thing I noticed was the coldness of the house. Not that the temperature was low, no. It was something much more palpable, as if the place had been trapped in a stopped instant. The walls, the decoration, the absence of life. Everywhere there was a silence that could not be explained. Nicholas's father took me to the boys' room. There, everything was in its place, with the orderly stillness that characterizes the homes of those who fear the unpredictable. The toys, the books, the small objects of his daily life. There was no sign of struggle, no clutter, nothing. It was as if Nicholas had left his life in that room, and left, never to return. As I explored the room, I noticed something strange. On the floor under the bed, I saw a crumpled piece of paper. I picked it up and, unrolling it, found a drawing. It was a strange figure, faceless, but with outstretched arms, fading into the darkness. I didn't understand what it meant, but something in the drawing disturbed me deeply. The line was Nicholas's, no doubt, but there was something in the style, in the way the boy had drawn the figure, that made me wonder if he was trying to tell me something. A coded message that I did not understand. Days passed, and the storm continued unabated. Clues were scarce, testimonies contradictory. People spoke of all kinds of theories, from kidnappings to theories of spontaneous disappearances. There were those who spoke of dark rites, others of an accident in the nearby forest. No one knew anything. Everyone, including me, was caught in a maze of assumptions. And yet something inside me told me that I had to keep looking. The case was eating away at me, sucking me in like a black hole. One night, as I was going through the videos and interviews again, I heard a strange sound from the hallway. At first, I took it as a distraction, but when the sound was repeated, I decided to investigate. The hallway was empty, all quiet except for the sound of rain and wind. But when I passed in front of Nicholas's room, something stopped me. The door was ajar, as if someone had left it unintentionally. I walked in, and what I saw shocked me. In the center of the room, next to the window, there was a small table. On it, a figure carved in wood. It was the same figure from the drawing. Faceless, with outstretched arms, and this time, something else. At its base, a message. A message engraved with a precision that could not be from the hand of a child. A message that said, "We will not let you go." The door to the room closed with a dull thud, and the air became thick, heavy. I looked toward the window, searching for some sign, something that would give me an answer. But all I saw was darkness and rain falling in curtains. The wind was hitting the walls with such force that I seemed to hear voices whispering through the storm. The next day, after a sleepless night of reflection, I understood what had happened. Nicholas had not left of his own free will. Something or someone had dragged him away, made him disappear. But he had not done it in a visible way. He had left no traces. He had made no noise. The key was in that carved figure, in that drawing. Someone or something was playing with the boy's mind, guiding him through the shadows, making him disappear into thin air. And I couldn't understand what it was. I only knew one thing. The darkness surrounding this case was much closer than I imagined. There was something much bigger behind it all. Nicholas's disappearance, like so many other things in this world, would never be solved in the simple way everyone expected it to be. Because deep down, there is always a bigger mystery lurking, one that is beyond logic, beyond evidence. Something lurking in the fog, waiting to be uncovered. And in the meantime, I would keep looking. Winter had come early that year. By mid-November, temperatures were already dropping below zero, and the city was engulfed in a blanket of snow that never ceased to fall. Every morning I awoke to the sound of the wind hitting the windows, and the streets were filled with a thick stillness that only snow can generate. The tracks in the snow were brief, soon erased by new storms that came with the same regularity as the clock struck the hours. There was something about that weather that had always disturbed me. The snow, the cold, the darkness that seems to envelop everything. Maybe because things seem to hide better under the layer of white. Or maybe because it is easier to forget an accident when winter covers it with its mantle. The case started one gray morning when I received a call that broke the calm I had been trying to create in my life for the past few months. An accident on the main road, just outside of town. An overturned car, one serious victim. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that made me think it was more than just another unfortunate accident. But something, perhaps a hunch, or a small sign that I couldn't identify at the time, made me decide to investigate further. It was not a rational impulse, but something much more primitive, almost instinctive. Arriving at the accident site, everything seemed too perfect. The overturned car, the snow around the scene with no footprints to give it away as the site of a recent collision. As if everything had been carefully arranged to create an image of an accident that, at first glance, looked completely accidental. The car, a gray sedan, had hit a tree. The impact had been brutal. The bodywork was dented, the windows were broken, and the snow was a dark red. The driver, a man in his 40s, was trapped inside the vehicle. From the looks of the scene, there did not appear to have been an escape or escape attempt, which is always something that strikes me. The victim had no signs of a struggle. There was also no indication that he had attempted to brake before crashing. The ambulance arrived quickly, but by the time the man was extracted from the car, he was dead. His face had been completely shattered by the impact. There was no doubt that he had died almost instantly. The coroner who arrived later gave me a preliminary report that confirmed what was already apparent to the naked eye. The cause of death had been severe trauma. The police began to do their job, taking photographs, surveying the scene, dusting for prints. But something about it all seemed too neat, too clear, as if someone had wanted the scene to look exactly like that. The dead man's name was Tomas Valdez, an ordinary man, with no prior record, no obvious problems. In fact, the first investigations revealed that he was a quiet guy, with no enemies, no debts, no psychological problems. There was no known reason for him to be involved in an accident. But still, something didn't add up. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary accident. Accidents are usually chaotic, unpredictable. But this one had something designed, something meticulously planned, as if everything had been carefully calculated to make the outcome inevitable. And worst of all, I felt trapped. I was standing on a track that had no more traces than I could find myself, and yet I felt I was being led to something else. I decided to go further, to investigate the life of the deceased. I was not relying on preliminary reports alone. There was something that told me I had to dig deeper. I talked to some of his acquaintances, his co-workers, his neighbors. Most of them didn't know much about him, other than that he was an ordinary man, an unremarkable man. However, one of his co-workers, a somewhat nervous guy who seemed to want to avoid talking about Tomas, gave me a clue. He mentioned that Tomas had been talking about something strange in the last few weeks before his death. He talked about someone following him, that he had been having trouble with a group of people, but he never went into details. No one knew who these people were, or what they wanted from him. At first, I thought it might all be paranoia. Stress, everyday worries can make someone imagine threats where there are none. But when I checked the messages on his phone, I found something I didn't expect. A text message, sent days before the accident, that simply said, "What you did will not go unpunished. You are too close to the truth." Something in that sentence disturbed me deeply. What truth was being spoken about? Why would Tomas have received such a cryptic threat? And most disturbing, why did these people feel so comfortable sending threats knowing that he could have reported it to the authorities? My intuition told me that Tomas was involved in something bigger than he appeared to be. Someone had wanted to shut him up, and to do so had orchestrated his death in a way that would look like a simple accident. But the little details wouldn't let me rest. The car overturned in exactly the right place. The way the accident had happened, it all seemed too well thought out. Traffic accident experts often say that even the simplest accident has its surprises. But here there were no surprises. Just a perfectly planned scene. I decided to investigate further. Someone knew something, and that person, or those people, wanted me to stop. The key was in what Tomas had discovered, in what he had unearthed. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became to me that Tomas Valdez's death had not been an accident. It had been a message that someone wanted me to see. Days went by and the snow continued to fall unceasingly, covering everything in its path, leaving behind a calm, almost perfect picture. But that calm was only superficial. I knew the truth was there, hidden under layers of snow, under layers of lies and manipulation. I knew I had to keep investigating, to go further, or Tomas's death would be just another in the list of unexplained accidents. In the end, after weeks of investigation, and after following the few leads I had found, I discovered what had been hidden. Tomas had been investigating a corruption case in which several important figures in the city were involved. He had discovered irregularities in public contracts, diversion of funds, illicit payments. He had started asking questions, talking to the wrong people, getting too close to the truth. And that was what doomed him. The accident was a calculated move, a way to eliminate a threat without leaving clear evidence. They knew there would be no witnesses, no way to link his death to the case he was investigating. It was a simple accident, a mistake that seemed inevitable. But I had found the truth. I had discovered what Tomas had unearthed, and I finally understood why he had had to die. What took my breath away, however, was the feeling that this accident, this death, was not just an attempt to silence Tomas. No, it was a message to me, a message telling me that if I wanted to move forward with my research, I had to be prepared to face the consequences, the same ones Tomas had faced. And as the snow continued to fall, covering everything with its white blanket, I knew I had entered a dangerous game that I could not easily get out of. Tomas Valdez's death had not been an accident. It was a warning. And now I, too, was caught in the same net. There was something unsettling about the old textile factory that stood on the edge of town. It was not directly in the center, where children used to play and couples strolled in the park, but rather at the end of the main street, where asphalt mixed with mud and fog. Ever since I was a child, I had always looked at that structure with curiosity. It was a large building, with high ceilings and broken windows, surrounded by a rusty iron gate that seemed the ultimate barrier against the passage of time. There was always something in the air when I walked by, a mixture of dust, mildew, and above all, a feeling that something had happened there and had never been told. Many in town said that the factory had been closed for decades, that its last days were dark, and that there was a tragedy behind its closure. The rumors were vague, often talking about an accident, an explosion, or even something much darker. I always took those rumors as part of the mystique that surrounds forgotten places, things people make up to give them an air of mystery. But time passed, and as the days grew colder and the seasons changed, something pushed me to go there and see with my own eyes what was really hiding behind those broken walls. I didn't expect to find anything special when I decided to visit the factory one day in November. It had been a gray, overcast morning with a thick layer of fog covering the entire town. The fog clung to the trees and the ground as if the whole world was being sucked into some distant, dark, undefined place. At first, it seemed like the perfect day for a solitary walk, away from the noise of the town, so I headed toward the old factory. As I approached, the structure seemed more imposing than I remembered. Although vegetation had begun to cover some parts of the building, I could see that in its glory years, it must have been a center of activity. The large chimney, which still stood like an accusing finger to the gray sky, seemed to have witnessed hundreds of stories. Something told me that there was still something there, something that could not be ignored. I entered through a hole in the gate, which was no longer strong enough to keep the curious away. The factory, despite years of neglect, had a strange stillness. There were no obvious traces of vandalism or signs of people who had wandered in to explore it before. The doors to the main entrance were locked, but a small opening in a broken window allowed me to peek in and realize that the interior was mostly intact. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from inside, but I decided it was nothing more than the mixture of the fog, the cold, and my mind searching for reasons to fear something that didn't exist. With a firm step, I climbed a metal staircase leading to what I assumed would be the second floor. The air, though cold, was not too bad, but the feeling of abandonment was palpable. The floor was covered with dust and cobwebs, and the walls showed deep cracks. However, it wasn't the state of the factory that made me feel strange. Something in the air, something invisible, seemed to be waiting to be discovered. As I explored, I went deeper into the building, finding old rust-covered machines and leather belts littering the floor. Every now and then, I would stop to look at an object or a part of the place, not understanding why I was so drawn to the place. The feeling that there was something dark hidden in that place started to get stronger, but at the same time, I couldn't stop myself from moving on. It was at the end of a long, dark hallway when I found it. It was nothing I was expecting, neither a valuable object nor a revealing discovery. It was just a door, small, barely distinguishable from the rest of the wall, but it seemed to emit a kind of energy, a strange pressure, as if it was waiting to be opened. It was the last door in the corridor, at the end, completely apart from the others. I didn't understand why, but something pushed me to approach it. The door, having been closed for so long, was somewhat rusty. My hand touched it and pushed it in carefully, almost respectfully. What I found behind that door was what I would never have imagined. It wasn't a warehouse or an empty cellar. No, what I saw chilled my blood. It was an office. However, it was no ordinary office. There was something disturbing about the decor, something that didn't seem to fit in with the rest of the building. In the center, a worn wooden table was covered with yellowed papers, all strewn about with a speed that indicated someone had had to leave in a hurry. There were index cards, employee records, production reports. But what really made me pause was a leather-bound notebook, open at one particular page. I didn't know what exactly I was looking for in that notebook, but something about it made me feel like I was about to unveil a secret. It was not the content of the pages that caught my attention, but the handwriting, a tense handwriting, as if the author was writing in fear or under pressure. What I found in those pages was chilling. It was not just a normal record. Throughout the pages, the writing spoke of an impending collapse, of something brewing inside the factory. The tone became increasingly paranoid, as if someone was alerting others to what was happening. There was talk not only of working conditions, faulty machines and mounting complaints, but of something much deeper, something that had never come to light. There were mentions of mistakes in production, of accidents that no one wanted to discuss. Then, on a particularly torn page, I read something that made me think that perhaps it had not been simple negligence that had caused the factory to close. Something went wrong, something no one expected, an accident. But it's not an accident, it's not what it looks like. What happened was, we can't tell the truth. There are things that must not be known. My mind began to spin. I didn't know if those writings were talking about a simple industrial accident or something much more complex. But the tension in their words was palpable. Something had happened in that factory, something that had been hidden. The factory had not just closed because of a technical or economic failure. There was something else, something that people had tried to erase, something that the fog and time had covered up. Suddenly I heard a sound, a creak, faint, but enough to make my heart race. I looked back down the hallway but saw nothing. However, the atmosphere I was in felt denser, as if the place was absorbing all that was left of me. I decided it was time to leave, but something inside me told me it was too late to run away from that story. That story of accidents, tragedies, and lies buried in the walls of the factory. As I was leaving, something made me turn around. Maybe it was a flash of light in the broken window, or maybe it was a premonition, but for a moment, I thought I saw a figure. A shadow that didn't fit, that had no reason to be there, as if it had remained invisible in that place for all those years. I wasn't sure if it was real or a figment of my mind, but instantly I felt that the place was alive, not only because of the ruins that made it up, but because of the tragedy that had fueled it. That night, when I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had discovered. The factory, the notebook, the documents. No one had talked about it. No one had mentioned it. And yet there it was, an abandoned place that hid a tragic story, a story that had not yet been fully told. What happened there, that tragedy that was covered up with the passage of time, was still latent. And although everything seemed to be lost in the fog, I knew that someday, someone else would discover what really happened in that place. But in the meantime, I was the only one who carried that secret with me. The only one who had seen the face of a story that had been forgotten. The air in the forest was thick, as if the clouds hanging above us were pressing the earth down. There was something strange about that fog, an invisible weight that made everything feel closer and more distant at the same time. It was a gray day. Tree branches rustled softly in the wind, but the atmosphere was unusually quiet. The kind of silence that does not bode well. Not a single animal, not a single bird. Just the fog, the shadows, and us walking deeper and deeper into the forest. At first, everything seemed simple. A group of friends who had decided to escape from the hustle and bustle of the city to spend a couple of days in nature. There were 5 of us. Mariana, the most extroverted of us all, with her contagious laugh. Jorge, the quiet guy who was always in the shadows, observing. Victor, the adventurer of the gang, the one who always came up with the craziest ideas. Carla, the pragmatist, who always knew how to stay on track. And me, who just wanted to disconnect from everything around me without thinking about anything. We had gone into that forest as we had done on so many other excursions, without worrying too much about the old rumors. The people of the nearby town talked about the Shadow Forest, as if it were a cursed place, full of dark legends and mysterious disappearances. They said that those who went in too far never came back, but that had never been reason enough to stop us. After all, legends are just that, stories that scare us for no reason. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. The terrain was uneven, full of roots sticking out of the ground, and the air was cold, but bearable. We walked for a couple of hours, chatting and enjoying the quiet. As we progressed, the fog began to thicken. Not alarmingly, but enough so that everything began to look blurry, as if the forest was swallowing the light. That's when we began to notice that something wasn't right. We had planned to hike for about 3 hours and then make camp. It was a simple plan, but by the end of the second day, we realized that something in our sense of direction had failed. The trees no longer looked like they did at the beginning. The formations seemed distorted, and we couldn't find our way back. For a few minutes, everyone thought it was just fatigue and the fog playing with our perception. But little by little, the discomfort turned into something deeper, something disturbing. First, it was Jorge who brought it up. He said he felt we were walking in circles, but we quickly dismissed it. No one wanted to think we might be seriously lost. However, minutes turned into hours, and as we went on, the feeling of disorientation grew. What made me most uncomfortable was the atmosphere of the place. The fog had worsened, and the cloudy sky did not let even a ray of sunshine through. There was no sound in the air, no rustle of leaves moving, only the crunch of our boots on the dry leaves, and the wind that, at times, seemed to stop and then blow with a strange force. It seemed as if the forest was watching us, watching our every move. Mariana tried to keep her spirits up, joking about how we were going to be the protagonists of one of those horror stories where friends get lost and never come back. But the jokes were fading. Carla began to look around nervously, and Victor stopped talking. Even Jorge, who was normally the quiet one, started walking faster, as if he was looking for something we couldn't see. It was then that we began to notice something strange. The footprints. At first I thought they were ours, but there was something odd about them. They were too fresh to have been left by us, and they didn't line up with our walking. Every time we stopped, we saw new footprints, as if someone else was walking right in front of us, but at the same time, there was no sign of life around us. We stopped in a small clearing where, among the trees, an old wooden hut appeared. It was small, dilapidated, and did not seem to have any use. The windows were broken, and the door hung on a rusty hinge. No one said anything at first. We were all too worried about the footprints to think about going in. But finally, the need to find temporary shelter compelled us to approach. The door opened with a creak that echoed throughout the forest. The interior of the hut was gloomy and cluttered. The walls were covered with moss, and the air smelled musty and rotting wood. There was no furniture, just remnants of what might once have been a home. But what really caught our attention were the marks on the walls. They were covered in scratches, as if someone had tried to escape, or perhaps had been dragged away. As we explored the cabin, we noticed something even more disturbing. An old wooden table in the center, with messy pieces of paper on it. It looked like a collection of maps and notes. But as I got closer, I saw that it wasn't so simple. On each map were red marks, circles that didn't match anything on the ground. The papers appeared to have been written by several hands, and the words didn't make much sense. Some spoke of follow the path, others of don't look back, and there were a couple of phrases repeated throughout: never stop, and don't go down the path of shadows. My mind began to spin, and a shiver ran down my spine. Something was not right. The fog, the tracks, the cabin, everything seemed to connect somehow. We were walking into something much darker than we had anticipated. We knew we had to get out of there, but the fact that we had lost our way meant we didn't know where to start. As we stood inside, trying to organize our thoughts and decide what to do, the sound of branches snapping in the distance silenced us. We all turned toward the door, but saw nothing. However, the sound was clear. Someone or something was moving through the forest. Fear settled in our hearts, and we didn't know if it was the fog, our nerves, or if there really was someone nearby. Despite our uncertainty, we made the decision to leave the cabin and continue walking. We walked for what seemed like hours, but the feeling of being trapped in a maze did not go away. The footprints kept appearing, and the shadows between the trees seemed to move, even though there was no wind. At one point, Jorge, who had always been the calmest, began to show signs of distress. He stopped short and looked at us with an expression of alarm. We had been walking in circles, as he had said at the beginning. The cabin, the tracks, the fog, everything was getting darker and darker. The forest was playing a cruel joke on us, and we didn't know if it was the place or if it was our minds giving in to fear. Deep in my conscience, something was telling me that we were being led. Something was playing with us, and it was much bigger and older than we could comprehend. The story of the dark forest was not just a legend. It was real, and we were caught up in it. Finally, after what seemed like hours of aimless walking, we began to hear the distant sound of rushing water. At that point, we didn't hesitate. We had to head for the river. If we could find it, we could follow its course and get out of the forest. However, as we approached the sound, we realized that there was no river. There was only a black abyss stretching out before us, an unfathomable void. The forest was closing its circle around us, and worst of all, we knew that, like the legend, not all of us would get out of there. The fog had invaded the city early in the morning. It had settled over the streets and the facades of the buildings, turning everything into diffuse shadows. It was not the kind of day that invited to go out. A cold, gray, oppressive day, where the air seemed thick, as if it was harder to breathe than usual. People were hurrying to and fro, walking quickly, hunched against the wind, their coats wrapped around their bodies like a barrier against the bad weather. I, like them, slipped through the shadows of concrete and fog, swept along by routine, not wanting to be there, but knowing I had to be. My life was simple, though not necessarily happy. I was an ordinary man, with an ordinary job in an ordinary office. I had no great aspirations, no bright future ahead of me. I was content with what life had given me, because deep down, I had never known how to ask for more. I was one of those who got up every morning, did what was expected of them, and went home at the end of the day. Sometimes I thought that if someone was watching me from the outside, they wouldn't even realize I existed. I was transparent, a simple cog in a larger machine. That morning, arriving at the office, I didn't expect the day to be any different than any other. I walked in as usual, greeting the few colleagues already at their desks. I didn't stop to chat. Routine was my refuge. I sat down in front of my computer and began to work, letting the murmur of the office become the sonorous background of my day. I knew the afternoon would be just as gray, just as monotonous, but at least the day would pass quickly. However, something happened that changed everything. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, as I was checking some emails and calculating the hours I had left until lunch, I noticed a strange notification on my screen. It was a message in my inbox. It was no ordinary mail, no meeting notice, nor was there a known sender. It just said, "You are being watched." Nothing else, no signatures, no other information. Just those 3 words, cold and disconcerting. My first reaction was confusion. I thought it might be a mistake, spam, or some kind of practical joke. Maybe someone in the office was playing games with me. However, something inside me told me this was not the case. The simplicity of the message, the way it was worded, unsettled me. I paused to think about the phrase, replaying it in my head several times. You are being watched. Who was watching me? And most of all, why was they sending me that message? I decided to ignore it. At first, I thought it would be best to delete the email and move on, but something stopped me. I couldn't. The feeling of discomfort persisted, like a shadow that kept haunting me. There was something about that message that made me feel vulnerable, exposed, as if something was lurking in the shadows of my daily life. I closed the mail and focused on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something inside me had awakened. That afternoon, when I returned home, I found myself thinking about that message again. My apartment was dark, with the curtains closed, as if the day had never begun. I put the key in the lock and walked into the living room, glancing around. The house, as always, was empty. I was alone. I was used to it. It had always been like that. I had no family nearby, not many friends to visit me, just me and the walls of my apartment. A quiet place where I took refuge from the hustle and bustle of the outside world. But that night, the usual quiet offered me no solace. That phrase kept echoing in my mind. You are being watched. The message had not only burned itself into my brain, but also seemed to have settled into the air I breathed. I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every corner of my apartment, every shadow, every sound, seemed stranger, more unsettling. I felt as if I were surrounded, as if the message was not only a warning, but a warning. The night passed slow, heavy. I lay in bed unable to sleep. The clock on the bedside table ticked relentlessly, but I couldn't switch off. I got up several times, drank water, paced the room, but all I could think about was that mail. It was clearly affecting me more than it should, but I couldn't help it. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling. The next morning, as I left the apartment, I noticed that something had changed in the city. The fog was still there, clinging to the streets, but now it seemed denser, more oppressive. People passing near me, who previously would not have given me a second's attention, now seemed to be watching me more intently. A passerby's gaze met mine for a second longer than would have been normal. A bus driver stared at me as I climbed into the vehicle, and even a paperboy gave me a quick glance before continuing on his way. It all seemed strange to me, as if I was becoming paranoid, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. I decided to go to the office as if nothing had happened, but the day began to fall apart quickly. Every time I sat down at the computer, I couldn't concentrate. The phrase kept echoing in my mind. Every moment I found myself looking around at the others around me, searching for something to indicate that I knew what was going on, as if they were all in on a secret plot. But there was nothing. No one seemed to notice anything out of the ordinary. Only I felt that pressure, that inexplicable discomfort. At the end of the day, I decided I had to do something about it. I couldn't go on living with that constant feeling of being watched, that something was stalking me from the shadows. I needed answers. For the first time in a long time, I decided to act instead of letting things take their course. But just like in thrillers, the answer didn't come easily. I returned home determined to find out more. I sat down at the computer, determined to find some clue as to the origin of the message. I did a deep search for any clue, for any link that might connect my life to that email, but I found nothing. The email servers seemed to have no additional information, and when I did an online search on the subject, I found nothing but forums with absurd theories about enigmatic messages. The feeling that something was escaping me was getting stronger and stronger. Then, while checking my inbox again, I noticed something strange. A new message. This time it was not empty. The sender was still anonymous, but the content was different. It read, "It's not just a warning, it's the beginning. If you don't understand now, you will soon." And below the sentence, there was a link. A link I was not supposed to open. The temptation was great. For a moment, I stared at the link, feeling the tug of curiosity. Should I open it? What would happen if I did? My mind was screaming at me not to, but my body, my anxiety, was pushing me to do it. After a long moment of indecision, I finally clicked. What I found changed everything. The website was empty except for a single image, a picture of me. A picture I don't remember taking, or that anyone else had taken. It was a recent image, taken in the office, just before I started receiving the messages. The file was dated a day earlier, and when I looked at the image more closely, I saw something I couldn't understand. In the background of the photo, almost imperceptible, there was a figure standing, watching me from the shadows. I couldn't see details, just a vague outline, but it was enough. He had been watching me. From that moment on, I knew I couldn't turn back. Something was happening, something slipping through the cracks of my daily existence. And now, I couldn't help it. The message had been just the beginning.